Let's go again to that video that we have that was shot over North Texas this morning of something that appears to be coming from the sky as we recap what's going on today, why we have broken into programming this Saturday morning. NASA has now declared an emergency after losing communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia just minutes before it was to land this morning. You're looking at video here once again that was shot somewhere over North Texas. And there is speculation that this could be the shuttle breaking up and falling to Earth. NASA has ordered flight controllers to pull out emergency procedures and to retain their records. The shuttle had 7 astronauts on board for a 2-week science mission, including 6 Americans and 1 Israeli.
And Russ, it's not really emergency procedures because at this point there's nothing the flight controllers can do for the shuttle. It is where it is. The procedures they're doing is simply trying to preserve all the data in their computer system so that they can go back through it later to try to reconstruct what happens. The shuttle sends back a tremendous stream of telemetry during launches and on orbit and during entry. Lots of data from temperatures, sensors around the spacecraft, hydraulic systems, fluid temperatures, all of that kind of stuff. They want to go back and look at all of that obviously after the fact to try to reconstruct what happened. Somewhere in the telemetry, they'll find that out. There's no question about it. One thing I was going to say, Russ, earlier is other things you have to think about on entry. We talked about the trajectory the spacecraft flies and how important that is from a heating standpoint. On the bottom of the spacecraft, where it attaches to the external tank, there's 2 areas where fuel lines go in. When they get into orbit and the external tank separates away from the shuttle, small doors have to close over that to protect that area. They always test and make sure those motors worked. I never heard anything about that, so I assume those doors were in fact closed as they need to be for an entry. The only other issue that has ever come up during this mission of any significance at all was a bit of foam insulation from the shuttle's external fuel tank that came off during launch and hit in the area of the leading edge of the shuttle's left wing. They get tremendous heat loads here on the leading edges of the wings and on the nose of the orbiter, and obviously if there was any significant damage there, that could be a factor in this. We don't know that. I'm not trying to suggest it. It's simply the only thing out of the ordinary that's cropped up during this entire mission.
We're approaching the top of the hour here, Bill. Before we get there, we're looking at file tape of a landing of a space shuttle here. Not sure which one this is.
That's Columbia. I can tell by the that's Columbia.
Now, Bill, is there anything what characteristics does the Columbia have that the other shuttles don't have? Anything in particular, any quirks, anything that astronauts talk about?
Well, you know, it was the first shuttle, Russ. It launched for the first time back on April the 12th, 1981. I remember watching that launch from my college at the University of Tennessee and marveling at the thing actually flew. You know, they never did a test flight. They just launched it the first time with Robert Crippen and John Young, the commander, on board. Columbia, is the first shuttle, is heavier than the succeeding shuttles. You know, as they built these, they learned from the process and they made them lighter. But Columbia is a heavyweight orbiter. It's one of the reasons that it doesn't go to the space station, has not gone to the space station to date, because it is heavy enough that it can't carry the kind of payloads that the other spacecraft, the Atlantis, Endeavour, and Discovery, can carry to the space station. But they had continued to make upgrades on this shuttle to improve it, to shave weight off where they could. And as a matter of fact, its next flight was going to the International Space Station in November, carrying Barbara Morgan, the backup to the teacher astronaut Krista McAuliffe, who died 17 years ago this January the 28th on board the Challenger disaster. Barbara Morgan, the first educator astronaut at NASA, was here at the Kennedy Space Center today. She had been flying on a NASA jet flown by Chief Astronaut Kent Rominger, who was flying approaches to the runway like they always do for landings, just to make sure everything's okay. So she was getting a bird's eye view of landing procedures. And she was expected on the runway after landing to take a look at Columbia, which she was hoping to ride into orbit in November. That obviously is not going to happen now.
We talk about this time and time again as far as the training these astronauts receive. Just how intense is it and how long does it take?
Oh, a long time, Russ. And for a mission like this, a flight where you had so many experiments on board, more than 80 research projects. This crew was selected 2.5 years ago, the research components of it, and they've been training ever since. Now, the mission was originally scheduled to launch last summer, and you might recall there was some concern about fuel line cracks last summer, and they grounded the shuttle fleet. As it turned out, they shuffled up the launch schedule after they got that fixed, and Columbia slipped to January 16th of this year for launch. And of course, nothing obviously known wrong with the orbiter when they launched it. They're very careful about that. that. And the crew took the advantage of that break between July and this January to continue training and even to take a little bit of time off. They said they actually enjoyed the break. But you're right, they're trained to a fever pitch, and during this mission it obviously paid off. They collected an enormous amount of data, and the scientists said that virtually every experiment worked as planned.
Bill Harwood at the Kennedy Space Center. Stay there. It is now 10 o'clock here on the East Coast. You're watching a CBS News special report, a breaking story from NASA's Mission Control in Houston. NASA has declared an emergency after losing communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia just minutes before it was to land. The Columbia was scheduled to land at 9:16 Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That's about 45 minutes ago. And officials lost contact with the shuttle around 9 o'clock, 16 minutes earlier as it passed over Texas. The sound you're hearing behind me is Mission Control in Houston. Let's listen in just for a moment in case there's some new information.
At approximately 8 a.m. Central Time this morning, as it was descending toward a landing at the Kennedy Space Center, scheduled to touch down there at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. Communications and tracking of the space shuttle was lost at 8 a.m. as it was approximately 200,000 feet above the north central Texas area. Search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area have been alerted. Any debris that is located in that vicinity that may be related to the space shuttle contingency should be avoided and may be hazardous as a result of toxic propellants that are used on board the space shuttle, and should be reported to local law enforcement authorities.
You're listening to James Hartfield at Mission Control in Houston, Texas. NASA has ordered flight controllers to retain all of their records. The shuttle had 7 astronauts on board for a 2-week science mission, including 6 Americans and 1 Israeli. The wives, husbands, and youngsters of the astronauts who had been waiting at the landing strip in Florida were gathered together by NASA and taken to a separate place. There is still no official word, again, official word on what has happened, but NASA has put out a public advisory to avoid any debris that may have come from the Space Shuttle. When I go back to that video taken over North Texas of something falling out of the sky. Not sure what it was at this point. The orbiter was at an altitude of 200,700 feet, traveling at about 12,500 miles per hour when contact was lost. In 42 years of human space flight, NASA has never lost a space crew during landing or the ride back to orbit. Right now, I want to turn to my colleague here on the Saturday Early Show, Gretchen Carlson. You have an eyewitness you want to talk to.
I believe we have a meteorologist who works for our CBS affiliate in Louisiana, Rob Perillo, who witnessed this Challenger or this Columbia potentially coming down from the sky. Rob, are you there with us on the phone?
Yes, I am, Gretchen.
Could you tell us where you are in Louisiana and what you saw?
Sure. We're in Lafayette, Louisiana, southern Louisiana, and basically we've seen the shuttle come in a number of times when it doesn't fly to the space station. It comes in on a different orbit, and it comes across southern Louisiana. And I happen to be the chief meteorologist at our local affiliate, so we kind of talked about it and anticipated, and saw it coming in straight as an arrow, and then the smoke plume seemed to spread out, and saw multiple things on the video, and what you're seeing there right now, and then basically all that debris took a left-hand turn as it pretty much crossed, it looked like, I would say, the Texas-Louisiana border. Tough to tell where the trajectory of the debris may have gone, but nonetheless heard a fairly long, protracted sonic boom, like multiple devices actually making reentry rather than just one device.
So you actually heard something then. We're looking at wire copy here out of Dallas and the North Texas area. Residents there say that they heard a big bang about the same time that the shuttle Columbia disappeared. And you're in Louisiana. I know this is on the border, but you say you also heard the same sort of sounds.
Yeah, we normally hear the bang about 5 minutes after the shuttle passes overhead and is getting close to Florida. It takes that long for the sound wave to reach us. And this time, instead of one singular bang, it was long, protracted, maybe 10, 15 seconds worth of multiple bangs, indicating multiple projectiles entering the atmosphere. So again, didn't look good, and knew something was wrong right out of the box. And then after what we're seeing on the video right now, after this shot, the smoke plume curled hard to the left, indicating that whatever debris was flying changed direction. It may have been just because of the way the aerodynamics of the debris that was flying. But the viewer in Palestine, Texas, Texas also mentioned the same thing. They saw the same thing from their aspect. Just to give you an idea, Lafayette's about 100 miles from the Texas-Louisiana border, and we were probably bird-dogging it about 100 miles away, probably pretty much at that point.
And Rob, give us a sense. I know you say that you've seen several of these re-entries back into as they're coming in for landing. But give us a sense how far up in the sky this is, because we've been listening to Bill Harwood all morning saying that the altitude may have been 200,000 feet at this point. Obviously, it was lower than that because you could see it.
Well, what we're looking at is the debris burning and the smoke plume from there. As far as I've calculated for our viewers in the past, normally I say it's about 50 miles up when we can see it, which is usually between San Antonio and Dallas. And by the time it passes off to our east, it's down to about 15 or 20 miles in elevation. So this is the time when it's coming into the atmosphere, making its re-entry and descending through the atmosphere, and it's slowing down from anywhere from about Mach 12 or 14, which is about 10,000 miles an hour, down to about 5,000 miles an hour. So what you're seeing right there is the debris going probably at about 10,000 miles an hour. And if it's not coming in on a good angle, or there may have been some sort of failure on board or tile failure underneath, I'm afraid our friends didn't have much of a chance.
Rob, I want you to take off your meteorologist hat for a moment and just put on your human nature hat. Not that they're one and the same, but as somebody who watched this unfold, what were you feeling in your heart when you were seeing this?
Well, unfortunately, I knew as soon as I saw the smoke plume going in different directions, it was something that gone wrong. I woke up my wife and my daughter, brought her outside, and I had the video camera set up, ready to go, and my wife spotted it. I locked onto it with the video camera, and then it kind of, I had that Challenger feeling all over again when you see more than one plume, and seeing it come in is a beautiful sight. We've seen it come in at night a number of times. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, meteorologically or astronomically speaking, and seeing what we saw this morning, we certainly knew there was something wrong, and I immediately started making calls to NASA. Yes, I can.
Rob, we want to thank you for joining us. Rob Perillo, meteorologist at our CBS affiliate in Lafayette, Louisiana. Thanks for your insights this morning.
Thank you, Gretchen.
Gretchen, there's a gentleman on the phone named Sam Knight. We're going to speak with him from Fort Worth, Texas. Mr. Knight, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Tell me what you saw this morning.
Well, my wife and I went outside to watch the shuttle come over Fort Worth at 8:03 is when it was scheduled. We walked out into the yard and were told to kind of look toward the north, and we kept looking and couldn't see anything. So we moved around the side of our house, and a lot of planes come over our house going to the DFW airport. And when I looked to the east, I could see two large vapor trails, very wide apart from each other, and almost simultaneously we heard a large boom, and then that was followed by a second boom. And I told my wife, she said, that sounds like an explosion. And I said, well, it sounds like a sonic boom to me. And I didn't think much about the double vapor trails, but when I got to the side and we came back in the house, they were showing the vapor trail across the top of the sky on the news, and saying that people had heard about an explosion but said it was a sonic boom. Now I know, having seen the results, that was probably particles of the space shuttle separated from each other.
I understand.
But it was pretty graphic. The explosion was, I'm not sure whether that occurred because of the time that elapses, when something's traveling that fast. But I would say this was about 5 minutes after 8 Central Time, right? Because it seemed to be a couple of minutes after the 8:03 that they'd announced on TV.
And 5 minutes after 8 would have been approximately 16 minutes before the scheduled landing. Mr. Knight, let me ask you, I take it that you and your wife, your neighbors, do this all the time. You go outside and watch the shuttle as it goes overhead en route to landing?
We we do, and you know, when we hear of something, the shuttle coming over, that's about as close as my wife and ever get to a space shuttle, is to be able to walk outside and watch it, because a lot of the descents with them landing in Florida, they do come over our area. So
I understand, and as someone who does this, who enjoys watching
Yes.
the shuttle go overhead en route to landing, what was going through your mind when you looked up in the air today and saw what you saw?
Well, bear in mind that I followed the golf business in my life, and that's what I've done all of my life. And having watched aircraft fly over our home, landing at DFW Airport, that's usually a single vapor trail unless it's extremely high in the air. And what caught my attention is the vapor trails were very definitely wide and separated, very massive, extremely larger than just like a regular jet that would fly over. And there were two of them, and the one on the left side was considerably larger than the one on the right. Now, that was just kind of instantaneous on my part. I had earlier in my life, I'd worked out at General Dynamics, which is now Lockheed here in Fort Worth, and watched a lot of jets fly. And so when I looked up and saw that, I thought, well, you know, that's kind of strange, but it's the Space Shuttle, and perhaps if that's the Space Shuttle, perhaps that's the way it's supposed to be. So
I understand. For those folks, and I want to say for those folks that are just joining us, you're looking at video here, which was now shot over North Texas, of something falling out of the sky. There has been no official confirmation as to what that was at this point. Sam Knight in Fort Worth, Texas. Hey, we appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you for your insight.
Yes, sir, and I'm sorry for the tragedy.
Thank you very much, sir. Again, nothing official just yet, but as Bill Harwood and others have told us, it does not look good. President Bush has been informed of the situation,
correct? Yeah, I
just
want this wire copy. President Bush has been informed about Space Shuttle Columbia, is awaiting more information now from NASA, and officials say there's no information that terrorism is involved, and I'm sure that's going to be, you know, the first question on the minds of people ever since September 11th, and the fact that there was an Israeli astronaut on board the Space Shuttle Columbia this time around.
And security was beefed up for that reason.
Security was beefed up for this 16-day mission, although we asked that question to Bill Harwood a little bit earlier in our coverage here, and he seemed to speculate that the shuttle would be at 200,000 feet at this point when it may have broken up, and that the idea of somebody being able to have an act of terrorism at that level would not have been a possibility.
Unlikely. Bill Harwood is our Hardman is our man at the Harwood. I'm sorry, Harwood. I apologize, Bill. Is our man at the Kennedy Space Center. Bill, you still there?
I sure am, Russ.
Bill, what's the latest from your end?
Well, I'm just reconfirming. Mission Control says the shuttle was at an altitude of 200,000 feet roughly when they lost communications with it. You can certainly see a shuttle at that altitude. You can see it when it's in orbit, when the lighting is right. As a matter of fact, a lot of us go out and watch it fly over quite frequently. And during entry, when it has a hot contrail behind it, that plasma trail as it comes through the atmosphere, it's very visible at that altitude. We don't know that that's where it broke up. It could have been lower than that. That's simply where the communications were lost from it. The contingency procedures are still in effect, and obviously they're still warning people to stay away from any debris. At this point, there's no way to know where debris would have actually fallen, given the altitude and how fast it was going at that moment.
There, as we heard earlier, the folks at NASA have alerted emergency crews in the Dallas-Fort Worth area to be aware of any debris there. Specifically, what, short of finding any debris, what is NASA waiting on before making some sort of official announcement here?
Well, I think, you know, like anything, you'd like to be able to know where it came down before you declared something, even though nobody thinks the shuttle survived. And I don't see how a crew could have gotten out of a breakup at that altitude. They have pressure suits on, but those are SR-71 spy plane type pressure suits. They're only good from, you know, under 100,000 feet. At that altitude, I don't think they would save anyone, even if you could get out. And certainly at that speed, they're not designed to exit a spacecraft going at Mach 12, which is what I believe they said, 12 times the speed of sound, or 12,000 miles an hour, I believe they said. So I don't think they could have gotten out. I think NASA just wants to make absolutely sure where it came down, but they've declared a contingency, which means that there has been an emergency, and that's in a shuttle with a glider. We're now 58 minutes past when it would have landed. It's definitely on the ground somewhere.
We talked about this earlier, Bill. We're coming up now on 1 hour after the scheduled landing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Take us behind the scenes. What's going on down there at Mission Control?
It's really two things, Russ. On the one hand, these men and women in mission control are extremely trained. They're going through procedures that have all been thought out in advance. What you do to protect data, you want to make sure you save all the data on hard drives so you can go back later and analyze it to find out what might have led to this failure and exactly what happened. At the same time, though, Russ, there's a real human drama going on, too, because these flight controllers train with these astronauts on a daily basis before flights. They're good friends, and all of them know in the back of their minds that those friends have probably been lost. I think it's a terrible climate to work in, and it must be a crushing moment in mission control right now.
It is now 10:15, 25. 10:15, 25 seconds here on the East Coast. We are coming up on 10:16, which would officially mark the 1-hour mark that the Space Shuttle Columbia was scheduled to land in Florida. At this time, we want to update you as to what's going on. Breaking story from NASA's Mission Control in Houston. NASA has declared an emergency after losing communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia just minutes, 16 minutes in fact, before it was to land. The shuttle was to land at 9:16, as I just told you, Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and officials lost contact with the shuttle around 9 o'clock as it passed over Texas. Once again, you're looking at video here shot in North Texas of something coming out of the sky. No official word as to what it is just yet. NASA ordered flight controllers to retain all their records. The shuttle had 7 astronauts on board for a 2-week science mission, including 6 Americans and 1 Israeli. The wives, husbands, and children of the astronauts who had been waiting at the landing strip in Florida have been gathered by NASA, and they've been taken to a separate place. And once more, I want to tell you, there is still no official word as to what has happened. Official being the big, strong word there. But NASA has put out a public advisory to avoid any debris that may have come from the space shuttle. Search and rescue teams have been dispatched in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The orbiter was in altitude of 200,700 feet, traveling at about 12,500 miles per hour when contact was lost. Gretchen Carlson, you've got another eyewitness.
I do. Stuart Fleming lives in Corsicana, Texas. Stuart, are you on the phone with us?
Yes, I am. I can barely hear you.
You can barely hear me. Well, I will try and speak up as much as I possibly can. If you can tell us this morning, did you go out to specifically watch the shuttle coming in?
No, I was just inside making breakfast, and I heard like the sonic bang. It's a noise I've never heard before. And I just went outside to see what it was, and there was like a big plume of white smoke, like a trailing plume of white smoke about just 100 meters from my head. Or maybe a bit further, but it was quite close, you know what I mean? And then about 15 minutes later on the news, they said the shuttle went missing. So, you know, 2 and 2 together equals 4.
Right. So Stuart, you were not specifically up around 8 a.m. Central Time in Texas this morning to go outside and watch the shuttle for its reentry.
No, I wasn't aware that the shuttle was actually coming back today. I was just, you know, doing life.
So you would have no idea that this was actually the shuttle. What was going through your mind after you heard that noise and then you proceeded to go outside?
I heard the noise and I said to my partner, I said, what was that noise? It sounded like something just killed everything. It was such a bizarre noise, you know what I mean? It was a noise I'd never heard before. And when I went outside, I could see the white smoke. And I'm like, well, it looks like the smoke from one of those aeroplanes that, you know, had smoke and they write letters with it.
Right.
And it was just this trail of white smoke, and it was just, but you could see where the white smoke started and where it ended. It didn't come all the way from up in the sky. It only started halfway in the sky, and then it went to the ground.
We're looking at pictures of that right now, Stuart.
Oh, okay. And it was just, I don't know. And then I said to my partner, can you go outside and look? I said, look at that. That is just too strange. And so he went and had a look, and I don't know. And then 15 minutes later on the news, it was on the news. And I'm like, that's it.
You put two and two together that that's in fact what had most likely transpired outside of your home this morning.
I think so. You know what I mean? It's so bizarre because, I don't know.
Have you ever seen the shuttle come in then for re-entry on a normal flight pattern?
No, I'm from Australia. We don't have spaceships.
Right. So this would be the first time for you. We're sorry that this is the first experience that you may have had. We appreciate your insights this morning. Stuart Fleming in Corsicana, Texas.
I'm actually from Australia.
Russ?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gretchen. As we've told you, Ilan Ramon, a colonel in Israeli's Air Force and a former fighter pilot, is on board this shuttle. And there were concerns for his security because it was the first time that an Israeli citizen had been aboard a shuttle, and there were some concerns by NASA. In fact, security was beefed up. Right now, we want to go to CBS News correspondent David Hawkins, who is in Tel Aviv. David, what are you hearing from your end?
Well, Russ, the Israeli television was covering the landing live, and Israelis are as shocked and as mystified about what happened as anyone else, and are awaiting the information about the circumstances of this tragedy, just like everyone else is in the United States and around the world. As you said, Colonel Ilan Ramon, a 48-year-old Israeli fighter pilot, was on board, and so all of Israel is waiting to hear about what happened. He's the first Israeli astronaut to go into space, and one of the few bright spots that this country's experienced in the last few years was when he was launched into space just over 2 weeks ago. Russ?
Can you tell us anything else about Colonel Ramon? I know his first, as you said, his first mission in space. What else do we know about him?
Well, he's the son and the grandson of Holocaust survivors. His mother and grandmother were both Holocaust survivors, and his father fought in Israel's War of Independence. Colonel Ramon himself fought in two of Israel's wars, the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and the Lebanon War in 1982. Russ?
David Hawkins in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much. We'll continue to come back to you throughout the course of the morning as more information becomes available on your end. Bill Harwood is standing by at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Bill, I'm paused for a moment because I thought I heard someone from Mission Control talking. Are you hearing anything else from officials there?
No, not at all. That's James Hartsfield in Mission Control, still warning people to stay away from debris if they find any. There are toxic fuels that could have survived in small tanks, and they want to make sure that nobody gets hurt. But otherwise, there's no word yet on where any debris might have landed, and no official word on the fate of the 7 astronauts.
We just heard from David Hawkins in Tel Aviv about the Israeli colonel on board. I know we've gone through this several times throughout the course of the morning, Bill, but because people are tuning in every few minutes, why don't you tell me again about the other 6 on board? 6 Americans, correct?
That's correct. The commander was Rick Husband. He is an Air Force colonel making his second flight and his first as a commander. The pilot was Willy McCool, a Navy commander, making his first flight. The flight engineer sitting directly behind and between the commander and pilot was Kalpana Chawla, PhD scientist on board as a flight engineer and a researcher. To her right, directly behind the pilot, Willy McCool, was Laurel Clark, a Navy submarine officer and physician who was making her first flight. Down on the lower deck were the remaining 3 members of this crew. As you mentioned, Ilan Ramon, the Israeli astronaut, was on the lower deck strapped in. So were Michael Anderson, the payload commander of this flight, the one in charge of all the research, and another physician, David Brown, making his first flight. Mike Anderson was making his second. So the split up on 2 levels on the shuttle flight deck as always, and no sign, as we've said before, Russ, no sign of anything out of the ordinary up until 9 a.m. Eastern time when contact with the spacecraft was lost.
Gretchen Carlson has a question for you, Bill. Gretchen?
Yeah, Bill, I was just wondering if you could go through for us again what the options may have been as far as what may have happened here. I know that you were talking earlier about when the Columbia actually went up into the air 16 days ago, that there was a piece of insulating foam on the external fuel tank that came off during liftoff, and this was of concern. However, engineers studied this and decided that it wasn't going to be a problem upon re-entry. If you could go over that again and maybe some other scenarios about what possibly could have happened.
Sure. You know, when the shuttle takes off, Gretchen, it weighs 4.5 million pounds loaded with fuel, and of course it has a tremendous amount of thrust. There's a lot of vibration. When this shuttle took off Columbia, you know, it's attached to an external fuel tank that rises up above. Some of the orange foam insulation on that tank apparently broke off and hit the left wing of the orbiter and the edge of its leading edge, they call it. That's the gray-colored area here. This is a special material that's designed to withstand high heat, because during re-entry, the leading edges of both wings and the nose of the orbiter are where the heat load on the shuttle is maximum. So that's obviously a critical area. If there was any significant damage on the leading edge when you got back down in the fireball of re-entry, that could degrade the wing further and cause structural failure. But I got to stress, Leroy Kane, the flight director for this mission, said yesterday during his normal pre-entry news conference that they had studied this in great detail. We're absolutely convinced, based on the nature of that foam, it's very lightweight stuff, that nothing of any significance got that damage. They didn't alter the trajectory today at all because of it. And he said yesterday they didn't expect any problems at all. Now, as you know, Gretchen, when the shuttle lands, it's a glider. There are no rocket engines firing except at high altitude. There are some small thrusters that fire to change the orientation until it gets deep enough into the atmosphere to control the flight. Are you still with me, Gretchen?
Yes, I am.
I'm sorry, I was hearing some talk in my ears. Other things to think about during entry besides the sheer heat load on the orbiter. One thing that is moving in the spacecraft, even though it's a glider, are 3 auxiliary power units. They're called APUs. They're located at the top part, forward part of the engine compartment of the shuttle. The hydraulic power units are what generate the hydraulic power needed to move the shuttle's wing flaps, to do the landing gear brakes for steering and all of that. Those machines generate tremendous horsepower. They spin at very high rates, and an APU failure is something some of us in the space business always keep in the back of our minds for launches, as well as rocket engine failures, you know, thermal protection system failures, and that sort of thing. There's nothing on board this orbiter that would have just spontaneously blown up or anything like that. You know, it does carry very flammable explosive fuels. That's what it uses in orbit to maneuver, and some of that fuel is being used during the descent. But whether or not an engine could have malfunctioned during a normal maneuvering burn, unknown. Whether the leading edge of the left wing was an issue is unknown. The health of the hydraulic power units at this point, to us anyway, is unknown. Mission Control could very well have telemetry on some of these systems we're talking about, Gretchen, that would either exonerate them or point a finger of blame, but we haven't heard about that yet. So I'm just looking at things that could, in theory, have gone wrong. We don't have any data that would give us any idea of what actually might have gone wrong.
Of course. Well, we appreciate your insights, Bill. I'm going to turn it back over to Russ Mitchell now.
Okay, thank you very much. Bill Harwood, again, stay there. We're going to talk to you in just a bit. I want to tell you it's the latest we have from the White House. This is a quote here from Gordon Jandreau. He is the spokesperson for the Homeland Security Department. He says there is no information at this time that this was a terrorist incident. Obviously, the investigation is just beginning, but that is information. That is the information we have right now. It is 10:26 here in the East Coast. I'm joined by CBS News correspondent Dan Rather. Dan, good morning to you.
Good morning, Russ. On a very solemn morning.
Yes.
As always, I think it's important to emphasize what we know and what we don't know. We don't know, in fact, that the shuttle has exploded. We don't know for a fact that there are no survivors, but it certainly looks that way.
It certainly does. Bill Harwood there at the Kennedy Space Center. We were talking earlier, Bill, and you just told Gretchen the various scenarios that could have took place here. Let's talk about that escape hatch, for lack of a better term, that could possibly have been used in a situation like this.
Well, Russ, you know, after the Challenger accident, one of the things that they looked at very seriously was how to put an escape system on the shuttle. They even talked about ejection seats that would fire out the top as well as the bottom, because remember, they sit on 2 decks, so that's not an easy thing to build. They talked about all sorts of systems. What they ended up doing was putting an explosive hatch on the side of the orbiter, the same hatch they enter the vehicle with. And in flight, the idea was you can blow this hatch off. A telescoping rod extends out into the airflow. The astronaut hooks his chute onto it, slides down the rod, and bails out. But that can only be used when the spacecraft is in level descending flight under control. If the shuttle is out of its normal orientation, it's doubtful it could be used. And certainly it can't be used above 100,000 feet. The astronauts are wearing pressure suits that are very similar to the ones the pilots of SR-71 Blackbird spy planes use. Russ, you might have seen those. You know, they carry the air conditioner with them, those bulky suits. Yes. They weigh about 70 pounds. They're only good up to 70,000 feet or so, and I don't remember the exact upper limit, but I know it's not above 100,000. So I don't, if this really did break up or have a problem at an altitude of 200,000 feet, I don't think bailout was an option for them.
Bill, it's Dan Rather. At this time of morning on a Saturday, we have a lot of people tuning in who have not been with us earlier. Let's go over right from the start, sort of points 1 through 5 of what we actually know has happened.
What we know, Dan, was that at 8:15 this morning, Commander Rick Husband and Willy McCool fired the shuttle's twin orbital maneuvering braking rockets back here in the back of the orbiter. They're flying upside down. They fired those rockets for about 2.5 minutes, and the effect of that was to drop the other side of the orbit down into the atmosphere. That's how they get home. The shuttle then flipped over. It entered the atmosphere normally at an angle of about 40 degrees. That's standard. It came down. It crossed the coast of California about 5 minutes before 6 or something like that Pacific time, and then crossed across Arizona, New Mexico, and on out over northern Texas, descending all the time. We know it got that far. They had telemetry from the shuttle. There was some voice contact right around 9 a.m. I remember marking it because it was a little bit unusual. The commander or the pilot, I'm not sure which, there was a communications about tire pressure indications. You know, the shuttle, Dan, as you know, has telemetry sensors all over it, and somebody saw some data that indicated a change in shuttle tire pressure. That was the last a bit of communication at 9 a.m. The astronaut in mission control, Charlie Hobaugh, who talks to the crew, known as the Capcom, then began repeatedly trying to raise them over both the primary circuits as well as their UHF radio circuits backup channels with no joy at all. And I'm stopping here to see what James Hartsfield is saying in mission control.
Communication with the Space Shuttle Columbia this morning at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time as Columbia was descending toward a landing in Florida. At the time, Columbia was at an altitude of approximately 200,000 feet above north central Texas. No communications or tracking from Columbia has been received by Mission Control since that time. Search and rescue authorities in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in portions of East Texas and other pertinent areas have been alerted to the Space Shuttle contingency. Any debris that is found that may be related to the Space Shuttle's contingency should be avoided and may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants that are used on board the Space Shuttle. The locations of any possible debris should be reported immediately to local law enforcement authorities.
Dan, I was saying up until 9 a.m. there were
through contingency procedures designed.
Absolutely no problems of any kind have been noted except for that tire reading message. And as you know, Dan, sometimes during entry when the heat builds up around the spacecraft, communications are intermittent anyway. That's not so unusual. But when they couldn't reestablish contact in the minutes ahead, that did begin to cause some concern. As a glider, of course, the trajectory is designed to bring the shuttle back to the Kennedy Space Center runway. It cannot fly anywhere else. It doesn't have the lift of a bigger airplane. It really flies a little bit like a brick. It's all under computer control at this point. And as the minutes went by, it became clear something had happened. Dan, you're correct. We don't know what yet, but we know it can't stay in the air. It definitely came down. It's definitely back on the ground somewhere, but we don't know the details of what might have transpired.
Bill, you said there was no indication of any difficulty, and I know the context in which you said that, but let's go back to some previous shuttle mission took in shuttle Discovery, and they did some examinations. Let's bring our viewers up to date on that.
Yeah, that's right, Dan. These are problems that they had encountered both last year and then again this year. Problems with some ball bearings, actually, big plum-sized bearings in the shuttle's fuel lines. That's not an issue on reentry, of course, because they were in the main propulsion system where the 3 main engines are, and those don't operate during entry. So that was an inert system, and I don't think anybody at this point anyway is thinking about that. Of course, there are any number of things that could have happened at altitude. I mean, things I would wonder about, as I've been mentioning earlier, was some potential damage to the leading edge of the left wing of the orbiter during launch when some foam insulation came off the external tank and can be seen on video impacting that wing. They said yesterday that they didn't believe that was any problem at all. They didn't change anything about today's entry. They weren't at all concerned. Up until the moment they lost communications, there was no telemetry from the orbiter that indicated anything out of the ordinary, at least that we're aware of. So much telemetry comes into mission control. There could be somebody down there by now who has some hint of what happened, but we haven't been told that.
And Bill, what about, there were some words after this shuttle mission had been launched about when the fuel tanks went apart from the shuttle, some little piece of something got loose. Let's review that.
Right, that's what I was mentioning during the launch sequence when some foam insulation came off and hit the leading edge of the wing. I don't believe the shuttle had even gone through the sound barrier at that point. It was right over the pad fairly early in launch. They could see it hit the wing, but because that material is very lightweight, they didn't think that it would have caused any significant damage at all. Of course, if they're wrong, and there was significant damage there, the heat loads this experiences, and I'm using engineering speak, it just means they get very high temperatures on the leading edge of the wing during reentry because of atmospheric friction. If there was a weak spot on the wing, that could certainly lead to a problem. We have no indication that happened, however, And yesterday, the flight director, Leroy Kane, stressed that they didn't think there was any issue at all with the wing.
Well, I want
which
to
leaves us really back at the starting point.
Sorry, Bill. I do, and I know you want to underline, italicize, and put in large caps. Nobody knows what has happened to the shuttle. What we've tried to do here is just go over a few things that, you know, looking back on it, you say, well, could that have been an indicator? Could this have been an indicator? But nobody knows what's happened to the shuttle.
That's absolutely true. The only thing we know, Dan, is that the shuttle isn't still in the air. That's the only thing we know. The shuttle is a glider, can't stay in the air more than a few minutes past its targeted landing time, and that was 9:16 a.m. Eastern time. So we know that. We don't know anything else at this point conclusively.
Bill, I also know that you've gone over this earlier, but again, I'm keeping in mind how many people are joining us in progress.
Right.
Now, the possibility of any of the astronauts getting out of the shuttle as it descended, you said we don't know much, but we know that it's down. Any at all chance that any of the astronauts, or all of them, could have escaped?
This is mission.
Let's listen to Mr. Hartsfield for just a moment.
To proceed through contingency plans designed to secure all information and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. Communications with the Space Shuttle Columbia were lost at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time this morning.
Dan, I think he's recapping what they've been saying. To answer your question, if the shuttle broke apart or suffered a catastrophic failure at an altitude of 200,000 feet, which is when they lost communications, the bailout system they have for getting away would not have saved their lives. If, however, they lost communications for some other reason and the shuttle was able to continue descending to a lower altitude before a catastrophic failure occurred, then that is within the realm of possibility. But at 200,000 feet, the system they have would not have saved them.
Bill Harwood, our veteran CBS News expert on the space program, reporting from Florida. Russ Mitchell, there are some eyewitnesses who are beginning to speak up and speak out now.
We have spoken with a few this morning. I'm going to go back to one we talked to about 30 minutes ago. Rob Perillo is in Lafayette, Louisiana. Mr. Perillo, you there?
Yes, I am, Russ.
Good morning to you, sir. Tell us once again what you heard, what you saw this morning.
Right, well, just a little background information. I'm a local meteorologist at KLFY, and we usually play up if the shuttle's going to be coming in overhead during the course of its missions that are not space station specific. And we were looking off into the west-northwestern sky, pretty much anticipating where it was going to come in. Usually it comes across here about 12 or 14 minutes before it makes a landing over at the Kennedy Space Center. And we picked it up. I got it on my video camera, and by the time I had it focused on my video camera, I started to see multiple plumes, kind of like the video that we're seeing right now. As I watched, it really then took a hard left from where we're seeing this angle's out of Dallas. It took a left, like debris had actually certainly obliterated, and then whatever debris was left, for some reason it went off to the left. I don't know why it did that. Atmospheric conditions indicate that there's a little bit of a westerly wind, perhaps a west-southwest wind aloft. And interestingly enough, I just checked some of the National Weather Service radars out of Dallas, Lake Charles, Fort Polk. They're all picking up a plume that extends from just south of Dallas into the vicinity, crossing Toledo Bend in Texas, and somewhere over Vernon Parish, that's in western Louisiana. Roughly, Lafayette's about 100 miles from the Texas border.
Mr. Perillo, it's Dan Rather with Russ Mitchell. You said that you were taking some video of this, some home video? Yeah,
my home video is a little bit cruder, but it's certainly picked up pretty much at this point. And at that point, once again, you know, your emotion is like you can't believe what you're actually seeing. And unfortunately, I kind of knew what was happening at that time. I went to the NASA website, and it was quiet there for about a minute, and pretty much knew what had happened.
Well, we of course would like to see that video, and if I may, I'll have someone be in touch with you about that. Thank you.
We'll upload it to you.
Well, I appreciate that very much. We'll have somebody do it. But I want, if you can stay with us just a moment more, I want to take you back to the first seconds when the shuttle came into view. Take me from the very first moment you saw it to the moment you thought something was wrong, and tell me what you saw.
Sure, Dan. Basically, from Lafayette, believe it or not, we can see the shuttle when it's somewhere around the Dallas vicinity. And at that point, my wife and daughter had spotted it as I was getting my camera set up, and it was a singular ball, what we're seeing right now. Normally, that's what we see. We see a streaking plasma streak across the sky here in southern Louisiana. I wasn't sure if we were actually going to be able to see it an hour after sunrise, so sure enough, we did see it, and at this point, when I saw multiple things breaking off, and then I completely lost it on the camera, I took my eye off the camera, and there was nothing left but a smoke plume. So obviously, it fell off our not only our viewing screen, but off our visual screen as well. Couldn't see it on binoculars either. Following that, normally when we see the space shuttle come on in, we'll hear the sonic boom a few minutes later, and it's usually a singular sonic boom and nothing overly too loud. This time it seemed to be a much longer protracted sonic boom with multiple announcements going maybe 7 or 8 times, indicating maybe multiple pieces of debris coming into the atmosphere.
Mr. Perillo, I believe was... Hold on for 1 second. We're going to listen to mission control here. Perhaps
8 a.m. Central Time as it flew at an altitude of 200,000 feet and a speed of approximately 12,500
Mr. Perillo, let me ask you, I believe when we spoke with you earlier, you had told us you were an amateur astronomer. Picking up on Dan's question, at what point did you realize that something was wrong?
Immediately, Russ, immediately. When you see that come in and you see more than one smoke plume, you know there's more than one thing coming in, burning into the atmosphere. And unfortunately, just like everybody else, it's kind of, and I remember the Challenger accident, same type of feeling, only knowing with my background and knowing what I know, I was pretty sure of what had occurred, and that's when I raced back into my house to check the NASA website, and it was dead silence there for the next minute.
Mr. Rod Perillo in Lafayette, Louisiana, we thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan.
We're going to check in very quickly now with Mark Knoller, who's at the White House, to tell us who knows what there and what they know. Mark?
Good morning, Dan. President Bush is at Camp David this morning. He went there last evening after his meetings with Prime Minister Tony Blair. We're told that the president has been briefed on the space shuttle situation. He was briefed by Chief of Staff Andrew Card. We're told there are indications that the president will be returning to the White House to more closely monitor the shuttle situation and respond to events. It hasn't been officially announced yet, although maintenance workers at the White House have been given the indication that the president would be returning within the next couple of hours. In addition, a spokesman for the Department of Homeland Security, Gordon Gendreau, says that there is no indication at this time that any foul play or terrorism was involved in the shuttle situation, and that also has been passed on to the president at Camp David, where he is monitoring the situation.
Mark Knoller reporting from the White House. We go to Bill Harwood in Florida. Bill, if you're there, bring us up to date. We're trying to keep, every 5 minutes or so at least, bring people up to date on the very latest. I don't think there have been any major developments now for maybe a half hour or 45 minutes, but let's take it right from the top. NASA has declared an emergency and fears the worst about the shuttle this morning.
That's right, Dan, they do. Leroy Kane, the entry flight director, declared contingency procedures in effect. It's kind of a haunting phrase because the flight director, Jay Green, back on January the 28th, 1986, said the same thing when contact was lost with the shuttle Challenger, which, as you know, broke up about 73 seconds after liftoff in NASA's first in-flight tragedy. In this case, it sounded much the same. The commands are all routine. They've told the flight directors and controllers to preserve their data from all the telemetry that came down from the shuttle prior to the moment when contact was lost, in hopes that after the fact, they can go back through that data stream and figure out what might have happened. So that's what's going on. They have not declared the shuttle lost. They have not addressed the fate of the crew. I think, as was the case with Challenger 17 years ago, they waited in that case until they had positive indication of where the shuttle had gone offshore and ended up. And I think that possibly is what's going on here. But there have been no more changes. They've just simply advising people if they find debris to stay away from it. The shuttle carries hypergolic rocket fuels. Hypergolic meaning they ignite on contact. They're very dangerous. And if any of those tanks survived whatever might have happened, they're just telling people to stay away from it and be careful. But other than that, Dan, no change at this point.
Bill, you said it before, but let's repeat it. We don't know a lot, but we know that the shuttle is down. somewhere it is down.
We know the shuttle is down, Dan. It makes the return to Earth as a glider. Unlike the lightweight gliders you can see at an area airport, it doesn't have the big wings and the lift that lets it loiter, as they say, or lets it fly around to make another attempt at landing. It has to make it on the first attempt. That's the nature of the beast. And of course, when the landing time rolled around, 9:16 a.m., within a few minutes of that, there was no question that the shuttle is down somewhere. But we have no idea where. All we know is that contact was lost around 9 a.m. There is video of material streaking through the air that looks very reminiscent of the Mir space station. That has very reminiscent of what happened to the Mir space station. If you remember, when it re-entered the atmosphere in a controlled entry a few years ago, it looks very much like that. But it's unconfirmed at this point exactly what we're seeing there.
Bill Harwood in Florida. I'm going to bring in now John Ira Petty, who's a spokesperson for NASA. Mr. Petty, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Tell us what you can tell us about the situation at this moment, please.
Well, as I'm sure you know, we lost contact with Columbia at about 8 a.m. Central Time. At that time, the spacecraft was on its re-entry path that would have taken it to the Kennedy Space Center for a landing about 16 minutes after that at 8:16 a.m. Central Time. We've heard nothing from Columbia since.
And at this moment, NASA's position is it does not know what has happened to the shuttle?
Yeah, obviously, you know, we've declared a contingency. The spacecraft is basically a glider when it comes back through the atmosphere. It's clear that the spacecraft is down someplace. We're seeing news reports that purport to show footage of what appears to be a breakup of a vehicle over the approximate path of where Columbia would have been. So we're greatly concerned.
You say no doubt that it's down.
Yes, I think that's an accurate statement.
But the fate of the astronauts at this moment officially unknown.
That's true.
We thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Russ, let's go over the names of the astronauts who were aboard this mission, emphasizing, as the NASA spokesperson just did, we do not know what happened to them. But it's fair to say, at the very least, we fear the worst.
That is true. 6 Americans on board, 1 Israeli citizen. First up, the mission commander, Rick Husband, test and military pilot. This was his 2nd mission, 45 years old, from Amarillo, Texas. Mission pilot, Lieutenant Colonel William McCool, test and military pilot. His 1st mission, 41 years old, from San Diego, California. Commander Laurel Clark, mission specialist, a doctor on board. It's her 1st mission, 46 years old, from Racine, Wisconsin. I'm going to try this Kalpana Chawla, mission specialist, aerospace engineer, 1st mission, 41 years old. Born in India, but a U.S. citizen. Michael Anderson, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, mission pilot, test and military pilot. This was his 2nd mission, 42 years old, from Spokane, Washington. And Ilan Ramon, a colonel from the Israeli Air Force, mission specialist, test and military pilot, 1st mission, 48 years old. His home, Tel Aviv, Israel. And Dan, as we've been pointing out, because of his presence on this flight, security was beefed up. Not that that has anything to do with anything. Nothing official, as we've all pointed out this morning, has been said. Security was beefed up on this particular mission because this Israeli citizen was on board.
Columbia's 16-day mission was to conduct scientific research in the fields of space, life, and physical sciences. This was NASA's 1st shuttle mission in 3 years that has not involved the International Space Station per se or the Hubble Space Telescope. In 42 years of U.S. human spaceflight, that goes all the way back to the beginning of the U.S. human in space program, there has never been an accident during the descent to Earth or landing. On January 28, 1986, as all of us alive of memory age at the time recall, Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after liftoff. But since that time, there's been a lot of investigating of that accident, a lot of retooling and starting ground zero. testing of the shuttles, and nothing untoward, Russ, had happened since that time, since this morning.
That's right.
And while there has been some speculation, including some of our own, about what might have, could have gone wrong, actually, we haven't gone that far. We just pointed out a couple of things along the way. A crack in shuttle discovery that they found.
Right.
They investigated all the other shuttles. Then there was this very small piece of insulation that they worried about, that it got loose when the fuel tanks got loose on this shuttle mission, but nobody knows what has happened.
Exactly, nothing official. And despite that problem on takeoff, the mission was considered a success. Apparently, there were no problems on board the mission in regards to that. We want to point out very quickly, it is now 10:49 here in the East. 1 hour and, I guess, 33 minutes ago, the shuttle was scheduled to land. And NASA lost control at around 9 o'clock Eastern time, and about 5 minutes after that, you heard the concern from the voices of mission control that something was definitely wrong. And here we are almost 2 hours after contact was last made, and we still don't have anything official.
Let's go to Bill Harwood, back in Florida. Bill, if you were there.
I'm here, Dan.
What have you heard in the last few minutes?
Nothing at all new, Dan. They're just simply, I think, waiting to get some confirmation of where the spacecraft or the debris from the spacecraft might have landed. I'm sure they're checking with military radar installations across the southern tier of the U.S. This is James Hartsfield again in Mission Control.
Contingency procedures designed to secure all information, notes, and data pertinent to today's descent by the Space Shuttle Columbia. Communications were lost with the Space Shuttle Columbia at approximately 8 a.m. Central Time, as Columbia was above north-central Texas at an altitude of 200,000 feet, traveling approximately 12,500 miles per hour. Search and rescue forces in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and in other portions along Columbia's planned route have been alerted to the Space Shuttle program contingency. Any debris that may be found that may be related to the Space Shuttle contingency should be immediately reported to local authorities and avoided. Debris may be hazardous due to the toxic nature of propellants used on board the Space Shuttle.
Dan, they're recapping where they stand right now. I don't hear anything new here.
Well, Bill, though this may be new, I'm not sure that you're aware of this, that NASA has now scheduled a news conference. It is expected around, and I use the language of the announcement, a NASA news conference is now scheduled to start, expected around 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Right, and I'm sure they'll give us at least some sense of what they know. And Dan, I just wanted to stress one more time something that you said earlier. Speculation in a case like this is not a productive thing. I remember when Challenger happened, and I've been struck by this over the years. When you're talking about a spacecraft as large as this, as far away as it was when this happened, traveling as fast as it was traveling, it's very difficult to know exactly what happened, even though you're watching it on television or seeing videotape. You know, people remember Challenger as an explosion, but the Challenger itself never exploded and didn't suffer even any fire damage. You know, it was aerodynamic stresses that broke up the Challenger, and it's very important to keep focused on. It's hard to tell from looking at that strip of videotape what might have happened today.
The Challenger disaster, January 28th, 1986. The Challenger, that's what you're looking at here, is videotape of the Challenger disaster.
That's right.
It was originally scheduled to launch on January 22nd, 1986. There had been some delays, cold weather among other things. It launched on January 28th, 1986, and just shortly after the launch, it became a ball of flame. Blast off at that time was at 11:38 Eastern Standard Time. It was the 25th shuttle launch. It exploded when a faulty O-ring seal failed. An O-ring seal failed 73 seconds after liftoff. 7 crew members total died in the Challenger disaster.
And Dad, if I could interrupt for just a second, they've launched 88 flights. This was the 88th flight since the Challenger disaster. All of them, as you know, successful. And I was struck earlier today, Dan, Barbara Morgan, who was Krista McAuliffe's backup. And as you remember, Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher, was on board the Challenger in 1986. Barbara Morgan, her backup, was here at the Space Center. She is now an astronaut. She was here today flying approaches with the chief astronaut in a training jet to fly approaches before the shuttle got here. She was going to fly on Columbia in November of this year to become the first educator astronaut in space, to fulfill Krista McAuliffe's legacy. She was here to see her shuttle, obviously, and her friends who are on board this spacecraft. And once again, She was here today when what may have well been a tragedy took place.
Bill Harwood, thanks. Bill, we think somebody on the phone now who believes that he may have some, underscore the word, have some debris from the shuttle in his backyard. Let's try to bring him up now. Sir, are you on the phone with us?
Yes, I'm here, Mr. Rather.
Dan, please, if you would tell us who you are, where you are, and what you see.
My name's Mike. I'm in Euless, Texas, and a little over an hour ago I heard a loud explosion, and a big piece of what appeared to be metal landed on my property. And it's lying there now, and there's a lot of people here, obviously, out and looking at it. And they believe that it's one of Baba Booey's teeth.
Oh, you got a crank.
Hold on just one moment, Mike, if you will. Mike, a lot of people don't know where Euless, Texas is. From Dallas, you are in what direction and where?
You're a real idiot, you know that?
Yeah, this is unfortunately, in these breaking news situations, you have goofballs like him calling up. That was a crank call, unfortunately.
Well, it was a crank call, and it is true I'm an idiot, but that's beside the point. There's some times when our system of keeping these crank callers off of the phone works, and sometimes it doesn't. This morning it didn't work. We apologize to you for that. That was a mistake on our part, abject apology for it, and we move on. There are some eyewitnesses who obviously are not cranks. Residents of North Texas, a number of residents throughout the northern part of the state said they saw flames and heard a window rattling boom Saturday about the time the Space Shuttle Columbia apparently disintegrated on its way to a scheduled landing at Cape Canaveral. John Perillo of Carrollton, just north of Dallas, said, and I quote, "It was like a car hitting the house or an explosion. It shook that much." NASA declared an emergency after losing communication with Columbia. They did that as the ship soared across Texas at an altitude of about 200,000 feet while traveling at 6 times the speed of sound, and then it disappeared. The space agency said search and rescue teams in the Dallas-Fort Worth area were alerted. Now, the phrase search and rescue teams would indicate that NASA at that point was still holding out some, no matter how wan, hope that somebody might be found alive off of the shuttle. At some point, that will become a search and recovery effort once NASA determines in its own mind and publicly acknowledges that there are no survivors. They have not yet done that. Helen Watts with the Dallas Fire Department said search and rescue teams were on standby but had not been dispatched to any locations. We have some reason to believe that that's changed as of now. Now, Gary Hunsinger in Plano said he saw the shuttle flying overhead, and I quote, "I could see 2 bright objects flying off each side of it. I just assumed that they were chase jets." There were no chase jets in the area, of course. And Perillo told the Associated Press, and I continue to quote him directly, "I was getting ready to go out. I heard a big bang, and the windows shook in the house." Now, bulletin from North Texas. NASA now says shuttle debris sighted in north central Texas. No further details. Repeating this bulletin, NASA now says officially that shuttle debris has been sighted in north central Texas. Doesn't say where or under what circumstances. Let's go back to Bill Harwood in Florida. Bill?
Dan, I just wanted to say, and we can't move our camera in here, but the security teams here at the Kennedy Space Center have just lowered the flag to half staff here at the press site, which is obviously an indication. And it's a poignant scene, I must say.
As we look at the pictures of the crew of the shuttle, we go to Mark Nola at the White House. Mark?
Dan, we got word a little while ago that President Bush has now left Camp David to return to the White House. The president is motorcading back to the White House from Camp David because of the weather, low cloud cover. Marine One was unable to be used to return the president, so instead of a 20-minute helicopter ride, it'll take about 90 minutes for Mr. Bush to return to the White House. It is certainly an indication that while NASA has not announced what happened to Columbia, that the White House fears the worst. The president would be able to more closely monitor developments in the shuttle situation from the White House and respond to it. We certainly would expect him to make a statement of some kind shortly after his return to the White House in about an hour or so.
Mark Nola at the White House repeating that NASA has tentatively scheduled a news conference for about 11:30 Eastern Time. That would, of course, be 10:30 in the Central Time Zone. And we should have a summation of what's known and not known from an official standpoint at that time. Russ?
It is now 11 o'clock here on the East Coast, and as you said, Dan, every few minutes, because folks are getting up on Saturday morning and tuning us in, we want to remind people why we're here this morning. You are watching a CBS News special report. There is still no official word from NASA, but it would appear the Space Shuttle Columbia has been lost. NASA now is saying that shuttle debris has been sighted in north central Texas. Mission Control lost contact with the shuttle just minutes before it was to land this morning at 9:16 Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The shuttle was over Texas at the time. NASA has declared an emergency and has scrambled rescue teams from the Dallas-Fort Worth area. President Bush, who was at Camp David in Maryland, is on his way back to the White House and is receiving updates. NASA has put out a public advisory to people in Texas to avoid any possible hazardous debris that may have come from the space shuttle. Bill Harwood at the Kennedy Space Center, let me ask you very quickly, you mentioned down there that the flags have been lowered to half-staff. At what point, short of finding any debris, would NASA come out and make an official announcement as to what's going on?
I would guess, Russ, and I'm hearing people talking in my ear, I'm having a little trouble hearing you, but I would guess at this news conference they'll tell us what they know. In the case of the Challenger accident, it was several hours after the fact before they came out and said the crew was feared lost.
I see. We talked about this earlier, Bill. The families of the astronauts had gathered there at the Kennedy Space Center. I understand that there was a luncheon scheduled for the astronauts and their families upon the safe return of the shuttle. From what you know, where are the families now?
Usually the families are at the runway by that point in the descent. There's a special spot for reporters, VIPs, and family members to watch the shuttle land. I assume, I don't know, I assume they were at the runway, whichever family members were here. The plan was for the astronauts to get off the shuttle, go back to crew quarters for medical checks and exams as follow-ups to some of the research they've been doing. And you said luncheon. I think it was more casual than that. I think once the exams are over, they simply enjoy a light lunch and just reunions with their friends and family. Nothing all that formal, but I believe they were here at the runway when this happened.
Bill, Dan Rather, there's bound to be a long investigation by NASA.
Oh, yeah.
It's far too early to even speculate about how far this will.
Afternoon to them, but I'm sure Mission Control has told them. The Space Station Mission Control Center is literally just down the hall from where the shuttle controllers sit, and I'm quite certain they know what's happened at this point.
Well, for clarity, there are 3 astronauts in the space station. They're due to come back by another shuttle flight, flight in March.
Correct.
But if for any reason, if for any reason it's determined that the shuttle flight shouldn't go up to get them, they could come back with that Soyuz emergency vehicle that's attached to the space station.
Absolutely, Dan, and they also have quite a few supplies. They always leave the space station with enough supplies on board to last a crew long enough to get past any reasonable shuttle launch delay. So I'm sure they're good as they are today, well into the spring before you would have to start entertaining the possibility of coming home on a Soyuz. Now, of course, as you know, in the case of Challenger, there was an issue, a long-standing issue with the boosters that we weren't aware of at the time that took a lot of research to get back through. It's not clear yet. It could well be that whatever happened today, it could be something complicated. It could be something that'll leap out of the telemetry at them and be relatively easy to fix. I think the big question is losing an irreplaceable $3 billion spacecraft. There's no production line left for space shuttles. It leaves NASA with 3 orbiters, and you have to. It then becomes a political question about what the government and what the country wants to do with the space program now that it's down to 3 space shuttles.
Bill, I hope that you'll bear with us here. That a lot of people might not know what telemetry means. You say the information comes out of telemetry.
Right.
Let's go through that. What do you mean by that?
The shuttle is wired up with sensors literally all over it, from everywhere from tire pressure sensors that just measure how much air is in the landing gear tires to fuel temperature sensors, flow rates, cabin air, all of that. There's a very heavy stream of this data that gets sent back by the shuttle's flight computers throughout a mission, and during descent especially. All of those data streams, I'm calling them, basically coded radio signals that have data in them about temperatures, pressure, velocity, altitude, all of those things about how all of the subsystems in the shuttle are working from second to second. Some of those systems are sampled, meaning they take a little snapshot of the data every few seconds. Some are happening more than once per second. All of that data comes down to the ground. They've asked the engineers to lock it all on the hard drives to preserve it, because they'll go back through all that data line by line in the days ahead to look for any indication of what might have led to this. And I can tell you, based on past experience with the shuttle, I'm quite certain they'll find something, because no accident, even though it looks like it happens in the wink of an eye, when you have computers checking these things, many times a second, I'm sure they'll see something that'll give them at least a hint of what might have gone wrong. But to this point, we don't know what that is.
But we'll be back to you shortly. Let's go to Mark Knoller at the White House. Mark.
Dan, the official word from the White House is that the president left Camp David by motorcade just a little bit after 11 a.m. Eastern Time. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes for the president to get back to the White House. The reason he is motorcading instead of flying by Marine One is that the weather is inclement. It was the reason that the president and British Prime Minister Tony Blair were unable to have their meeting at Camp David yesterday, as was the plan. So the president is motorcading back. He had been informed of the shuttle situation earlier in the morning by White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card. The president had spent the night at Camp David. As a result of the information that he received, he decided it was best for him to return to the White House. If anything is an indication that the White House fears the worst about the Shuttle Columbia, it is that the president is returning. By coming back to the White House, it enables him to better monitor developments in the situation, to be briefed on what happened, on what it means, and also to address the nation on the impact of a shuttle disaster or a apparent shuttle disaster of this nature. And that's what we're waiting for. He should be back at the White House about 12:15 p.m. Eastern Time, a little over an hour and 10 minutes from now.
Mark Knoller at the White House. The next scheduled event, and I use the word scheduled loosely, it will be about 11:30 Eastern Time. That would be about 23 minutes from now. NASA is scheduling its first official news conference since word that the shuttle went down over North Texas. The fate of the crew officially unknown, but the flag has been lowered to half-staff at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That would be an indication, a very strong indication of what NASA believes has happened to the crew, but I emphasize there's been no official word on the fate of the crew. NASA has said, number one, that the space shuttle is down. Number two, that what's believed to be some debris has been located in North Texas. Site of that and other details unknown, but those are two telling facts that we have. NASA says the space shuttle is down. Two, it says that some debris, what it believes some debris has been found. And then off to the side, if you like, the flag has been lowered at half-staff in Florida. Now, NASA will be holding this news conference at or about 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central Time. Now, for those of you who followed the space program, the American manned humans in space program since its inception in the early 60s, this is the third disaster, if you will. The first was what was now called Apollo 0. You know, the Apollo program is what took the United States to the moon. A training session on the launch pad in January of 1967. It was scheduled to be the first manned mission on February of 1967. Fire swept through the command module, and the crew died in that Apollo 0. Virgil Grissom, Edward White, Roger Chaffee. Now, we also had the Apollo 13 accident in space, which the well-known movie was made about Apollo 13 in the early 1970s, in which they had a crisis aboard the spacecraft. But in that case, April 17th, 1970, the crew, James Lovell, John Swigert, Fred Haas Jr., they all got back to Earth. And then, of course, we had the disaster of Shuttle Challenger in the mid-1980s, in which the crew was all lost as the shuttle went into a fireball just some 73 seconds after takeoff. Russ Mitchell.
Dan, 7 astronauts were on board the Space Shuttle Columbia, 6 Americans and 1 Israeli citizen. Ilan Ramon, a colonel in Israel's Air Force and former fighter pilot. Because of his presence, security was beefed up around this flight. However, there is word from the White House this morning that there is no indication that terrorism has been involved in what may have transpired today. I'm going to go right now to CBS News correspondent David Hawkins, who is in Tel Aviv. David, I know the launch was scheduled to be covered by Israeli television there. What's the latest from your end?
Well, here in Israel, there's not much more information than is coming out of the United States. 2 weeks ago, a little more than 2 weeks ago, it was practically a national holiday here when Ilan Ramon, the 48-year-old fighter pilot and Israel's first astronaut, first man in space, took off. Today is obviously a day of mourning. His family, his wife and 4 children were in Texas to meet him. His father was here in Israel watching the return on television. Like many other Israelis here, Israel's in a state of shock. There's really no way to describe the situation other than to say that Ilan Ramon's flight in space was a bright spot in an otherwise gloomy situation here, and today it's again another Israeli tragedy as well as an American tragedy, and a tragedy for just about everyone. Russ?
We know the colonel is 48 years old. What else can you tell us about him?
Well, Colonel Ramon fought in 2 of Israel's wars, the 1973 Yom Kippur War and the war in 1982 against Lebanon. He's also said to have participated in the mission to destroy Israel's nuclear reactor in 1981, I believe. He's a distinguished fighter pilot and has been training for several years, or had been training for several years for this flight.
Excuse me, David, it's Dan. Of course, you meant to destroy Iraq's nuclear missile capacity in 1981.
Yes, Iraq's nuclear reactor.
Right. Well, one point we want to make, Russ and David, is that the Israeli being aboard the Space Shuttle is a continuation of a program by NASA that has gone on for some years to take aboard U.S. Space Shuttle missions, various people of other nationalities.
Yes.
There have been a wide variety of people of various nationalities taken aboard the Space Shuttle. This by way of NASA, the U.S. government, and for that matter, the people of the United States saying to the world that while we lead, and we clearly lead and are preeminent in human exploration of space, that we want to make it as global as possible. And that indeed was part of what this flight today that has ended so disastrously. I don't think there's any doubt that we can now say that it ended disastrously, since NASA says the Space Shuttle is down somewhere in North Texas. They've found debris. They've lowered the flag to half staff. And if you don't mind, I'd put up that photograph again of the crew posed for their mission picture. Colonel Rick Husband, Navy Commander William McCool, Navy Captain David Brown, Kalpana Chawla, Dr. Chawla, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, Navy Commander Laurel, and then the Israeli Air Force Colonel Ilan Ramon. All of them, to use the military phrase, missing in action, not yet officially presumed dead. However, the fact that NASA has lowered the flag to half staff in Florida is seen as pretty indicative of what they believe has happened. But we will know more in about maybe 15 to 18 minutes when NASA has scheduled a news conference. I want to point out to you, they haven't said it will start precisely at 11:30 Eastern time. One can understand that NASA, having been hit by a disaster, a catastrophe, that it will take them a while to determine the facts. And there's nothing that speaks louder in one of these situations, Russ Mitchell, than the facts. And up to now, we have very few facts about what could have happened to the shuttle.
Very few facts. David Hawkins, you still there?
Yes, I am, Russ.
One question for you. You mentioned a few weeks ago that it was almost a national holiday in Israel when it was known that Colonel Ramon would be on this flight. Given the world situation right now, even though this is a continuing program by NASA to bring folks in from other countries to fly on these shuttle missions, given what is going on in the world right now, was there concern in Israel for his safety? Were people wondering about that?
Yes, there was concern about the safety of the flight. My understanding is that NASA laid on extra security for the very reason that an Israeli astronaut was on the flight. So it was something foremost in many people's minds. Russ?
David Hawkins. Thank you.
Russ Mitchell, David Hawkins. We know from past experience when we have these kinds of situations that there is a tendency just to, fill airtime, just kind of blather on. I wonder if it isn't time for us just to take a pause, just on the air here, take a pause, think about these brave astronauts and what their families are going through at the moment. And we may want to do that from time to time during the day. Let's recap now for those of you who may have joined us late or just joined us. Still no official word from NASA, but it would appear the Space Shuttle Columbia has been lost. NASA now says that shuttle debris has been sighted in north-central Texas. NASA says that the shuttle is definitely down. Mission Control, remember, Mission Control is in Houston. The launches go from Florida, but Mission Control is in Houston. Mission Control lost contact with the shuttle just minutes before it was to land this morning at 9:16 Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The shuttle was over Texas at the time. People as far away as Louisiana report having seen it. The shuttle flies so high. It was at roughly 200 miles plus up when this happened. So people as far away as Louisiana report watching the shuttle as they had gotten used to doing on these shuttle missions, and then seeing it, thinking something was wrong. One reported seeing a ball of flame, another said it seemed to go to pieces. NASA has declared, quote, an emergency. It scrambled rescue crews from the Dallas-Fort Worth area and elsewhere. The flag next to the countdown clock at Mission Control has been lowered to half-staff. President Bush, who was at Camp David in Maryland, Mark Noller reports from the White House, our CBS man there, that the president is on his way back to the White House, and the president is receiving updates. NASA has put out a public advisory to people in Texas to avoid any possibly hazardous debris that may have come from the Space Shuttle. And let's make this very clear that some of this material, for reasons that may be too boring to go into, can be toxic. And that's the reason NASA is saying that to anybody in the North Texas area, any place else that thinks they have any debris, see any debris, stay away from it. NASA has ordered flight controllers to retain all their records. There were 7 astronauts aboard, including the first Israeli astronaut, as we've mentioned. Partly because of his presence, security surrounding this mission was tight. A spokesman of the Homeland Security Department said this morning there's no indication that this was a terrorist incident or that any foul play was involved. Keep in mind, if there's any doubt in your mind that the shuttle at the time it broke up and started down to Earth was far beyond the range of any missile that could be fired from Earth. We've had several people kind of call in and say, well, what could have been brought down by missile? The answer is no, not at that altitude. Now, we here at CBS spoke earlier in the day with the Fort Worth resident, Sam Knight. He described hearing what he called 2 sonic booms. And then he said they saw 2 large vapor trails in the sky at the same time. The Shuttle Columbia had been on a 2-week science mission, which until now had been deemed a success because virtually every experiment worked. The astronauts did their job. The orbiter was an altitude of more than 200,000 feet plus. As I mentioned, it was traveling at some 12,500 miles an hour when contact was lost. CBS News correspondent Bob Orr is in our Washington newsroom. Bob is an aviation expert. What can you tell us about the situation at this moment, Bob?
Dan, at this moment, like the rest of America, I think the federal authorities are just trying to get a handle on the tragedy that happened this morning in the Texas skies. We've heard the warnings, and we can't say them often enough. It's very, very important that people that may be near some of these debris fields stay away from that. There are hazardous materials, but beyond that, there's another component. The authorities at this time are focused on the 7 astronauts and their families, and of course, that has to be their primary mission. But beyond that, then there are the big questions about what happened. And in order to know what happened, they need to be able to literally put the pieces back together. They need to go through the recovered debris and figure out what caused this tragedy. After Challenger blew up in '86, There were a lot of critics who thought that the space program just had too many risks. Since then, 88 flights of the shuttle have taken place without any problem until this morning. The fact that it was on landing, this is a glider on landing, the fact that the breakup happened there is quite curious. On launch, of course, there are the giant propulsion rockets, a lot of combustible materials. On landing, far less fuel on that shuttle, just small fuel pods used for maneuvering of the shuttle. So they'll be looking at things like possible mechanical failure, some kind of catastrophic breakup. Might there have been some kind of pressure problem? But I want to emphasize, at this point, nobody, and I mean nobody, even has a good clue as to what went wrong there. The first thoughts, of course, with the astronauts and the families. Beyond that, the investigation will begin, and it will be lengthy. Dan?
Bob Orr reporting live from our Washington Bureau. The Associated Press quotes former astronaut John Glenn as saying that he and his wife had just turned on their television to watch the Space Shuttle Columbia return home. This morning, when communications from the craft were lost as it soared across Texas, of course, we all know John Glenn, former United States Senator, a national hero, as the first American to orbit the Earth. Astronaut and former Senator Glenn said, and I quote, "We were going to watch the landing and then it got into trouble." Continue to quote him, "Anytime you lose contact like that, there's a big problem. Of course, once you went for several minutes without any contact, you knew something was terribly wrong." And indeed, something was terribly wrong. The shuttle is down somewhere in Texas. NASA reports finding some debris, didn't say where, and no other details are available. Flag has been lowered to half staff next to the launch site in Florida, and we await official word from NASA, which is scheduled to begin a news conference sometime on the order of 10 or 11 minutes from now. Bob McNamara, our CBS News correspondent in Dallas, what have you learned about those near ground zero in and around North Texas?
This morning, apparently thousands of people either heard the shuttle explode or saw it break up in the skies. Those who saw it break up say it looked like a falling meteorite that just disintegrated. Some report that the force of the explosion shook their homes. Now, the search at this time appears to be in the southeast Texas area. There are reports that pieces of debris have come down in the town of Nacogdoches itself. That's in southeast Texas, deep southeast Texas, in the Piney Woods region. Pieces of apparent structure were found anywhere from 3.5 feet long to 1.5 feet long. There was a man we heard a little while ago standing next to what he said was a piece of angle iron, which appeared to have fallen from the sky, and that was in downtown Nacogdoches. There are also reports of possible debris being found around the areas of Palestine, Texas, Tyler, Texas, Lufkin, also Jasper. There were reports also there could be debris down in a field near Corsicana where there was an apparent fire. People who were driving along Interstate 45, which is the main artery between Dallas and Houston, say they saw or heard the shuttle come down. Also, people who were driving on I-35, which is between Dallas-Fort Worth and Waco, say they heard or saw it. There is also a report in Plano, which is just north of Dallas, a large suburb where a piece of debris apparently came through an apartment building and started a fire there. We called there a little while ago, and the fire department said that they were putting foam on it. Now, they have warned people that if pieces of debris are found, to stay away from them, don't touch them because of the exotic fuels involved and apparent toxicity. So that's what we hear now, Dan. It all appears to be in southeast Texas, over near the Texas-Louisiana border, in the Corsicana area, Nacogdoches in particular. Dan?
Bob McNamara in Dallas. Well, as Bob says, that the indications now are that most of what's left of the shuttle will be found in southeast Texas in the general area of Corsicana and Nacogdoches. For those of you who don't know that part of the world, it's heavy pine tree country. Part of southeast Texas has a particularly almost impenetrable forest swamp area known as the Big Thicket. In this area, it may be a long while, just knowing that area, it could be a long while before even most, if not all of the debris is found because of the nature of this part of the state. The Texas-Louisiana border, heavily forested with pine. There are swampy, as I say, almost jungle areas in that part of the world. And so the indication being that most of the shuttle debris may, I underscore the word may, be in that area would indicate that it may be a long, long while before they're able to come up with even most of the debris. Let me pause and say that we're trying to be as careful as we can in our coverage this morning to tell you what we know, what are facts, and separate that out from what is speculation. We're trying to keep speculation to an absolute minimum, if possible. But even when we have reports that we believe to be true, I think as a journalist it's important to say that in these kinds of situations, frequently the first things you hear turn out to be not right, or at least not quite right. So when we talk to you here and do our best to report to you, it's in that context and from that perspective. Russ Mitchell, who's been working this story all morning long. Russ, once again, we as a people became, we Americans, kind of blasé about exploration in space. It was the shock of the shuttle in the mid-1980s, but then things have gone so well since then that we just begin to think, well, it's sort of like a bus going up in space.
Right.
They leave regularly, they return regularly, and we've been reminded this morning that it's very, very dangerous.
These became routine to us, and to see the shuttle land as we have many times before, it seems so easy. It almost looks like a huge airplane landing, one that can almost land anywhere. But as Bill Harwood has told us several times today, that's not the case. This is something that requires a special landing area, and once again we are reminded that this is not routine.
Well, I heard someone once describe the shuttle as a space truck. And in a way it is. That is, it hauls equipment up and comes back. But that really diminishes the accomplishment of putting these huge vehicles up in space and getting them back in sort of routine fashion. But then from time to time we're reminded how dangerous, and in this case even deadly, it can be. Rob Perillo, a local meteorologist in the area of Lafayette, Louisiana, and he is the meteorologist for our Lake Charles, Louisiana station. Now, are you with us there, Rob?
Yes, I'm with you, Dan.
And Rob, I want you to go over again what you saw, and you have a photograph showing the breakup of the shuttle?
Yeah, we're dumping off the video right now to our local videographers. Basically, I look for the shuttle when it comes in across southern Louisiana. Every time it has a trajectory to come across our region, it either comes in via Dallas. We're in Lafayette, Louisiana, and it'll either come in through Dallas or San Antonio. And I shot the video earlier this morning and knew what I saw when I saw it. What you're looking at right now is actually National Weather Service radar, Doppler radars, picking up on the plume of the shuttle as it was moving to the east-southeast. So that line that you see on your screen there from just south of Tyler on through the Toledo Bend area is actually the plume of the Space Shuttle, and probably we're shooting that at about 20,000 feet.
I want to make clear, because I in no way want to confuse our viewers, what you are looking at, what you looked at there at the end, is a satellite photo taken for meteorological purposes primarily. That was a satellite photo. Couldn't tell much, but you could, for those of you who are acquainted with space flight, could see the indication that the shuttle was breaking up. Now, I'm told that Rob Perillo has his own video, which this is the meteorological shot, if you will.
Right.
But Rob, you have some video of your own, which you're trying to get to us, and we look forward to seeing.
Yeah, I pretty much, from my angle, saw a singular system coming in and then moving into multiple projectiles pretty much coming at us. And again, these are national, that video right there is what I saw, again, coming at us. We see it about 100 miles away when it's crossing the Texas-Louisiana border. And again, I saw that particular shot. I saw the multiple projectiles spreading out in a manner that was quite random. And then what I went ahead and sent to one of your directors was the National Weather Service radar site that we just showed, and the Doppler radar is actually picking up on that smoke plume that you see right there. That's the smoke plume, and that's the direction that more than likely the debris would be falling in across southeast Texas, perhaps into western Louisiana. And as you mentioned earlier, Dan, a very thick area, very woodsy area, a lot of evergreens in that area, so maybe some time before debris is completely discovered.
Rob, as we await your video, this is Russ Mitchell, by the way, Rob, as we await your video, what can we expect to see on that? What did you see through the lens?
Well, you know, it's unfortunately, I'm an amateur videographer, so it wasn't the best video in the world, but nonetheless, it did indicate a singular plume and then multiple plumes and, of course, fireballs heading in different directions. And, in fact, I did see a little bit of a turn to the northeast on the plume, and I did hear one viewer talk about that as well. A viewer from northeast Texas also described that. So some of it seemed to take a sharp left turn off or turn to the north and east right at the end of when we saw this thing breaking up. A little bit past this point, this is where I picked up watching it, and then as we got in a little bit closer, this is what I saw, and that turn again a little bit off to the east-northeast. There again you see on the National Weather Service radars. In fact, we've confirmed this on not only the Lake Charles radar, but also Shreveport, Fort Polk, and Dallas, the same plume, and in all likelihood that is the plume of the debris plume and the vapor plume left from the shuttle.
Rob, Dan Rather, from this satellite picture superimposed over a map, all you can do is use your knowledge and give a knowledgeable opinion. From this, it would appear most of the debris is going to be over, you say, the Toledo Bend area of southeast Texas?
Yeah, I would say draw a straight line right along that. We are picking up on those Doppler radars winds at about 20 or 25,000 feet. So that's pretty much the line that the shuttle was coming in. And since, from what I'm hearing with respect to some of the debris discoveries right now, I would estimate that the bulk of the debris would be in eastern Texas and perhaps streaming into western Louisiana across, say, Vernon Parish. Kind of tough to tell when you get projectiles that are moving at 5,000 or 8,000 miles an hour how quickly and where they're going to land. But nonetheless, we confirm from what we see on the video that we see on also the Weather Service radars that again your plume and your debris plume may be across that part of eastern Texas into western Louisiana.
Rob Perillo, thank you very much. We're going to put up the picture again of the shuttle crew. These are heroes, and whether any of them are found alive or not, which now seems, on the basis of the facts we know, highly unlikely, but while NASA officially acknowledges that the shuttle, whom these proud and heroic people were aboard, is down, its debris scattered over southeast Texas and perhaps part of Louisiana along the Texas line, that NASA has not said anything about the fate of the crew. But the indication, as we've mentioned several times before, that they've lowered the American flag to half-staff near the launch site would indicate what NASA believes to be the situation. Now, the NASA news conference scheduled for roughly 11:30 a.m. Eastern time obviously has not started at that time. We see no sign that NASA is ready yet. NASA just simply sent word earlier that they were hoping to have a news conference in or around the 11:30 Eastern time, 10:30 Central time period. So we await that, and at that time expect to have more information. But Russ, let's you and I go down quickly now as we turn this half-hour mark of what we know, what we don't know. The shuttle got into trouble over North Texas just after 9 a.m. Eastern time, just after 8 a.m. Central time this morning. Eyewitnesses described seeing what they thought was the shuttle in trouble. Chris Linville said, from the viewpoint we had, they were looking out in the backyard, we did see some flames. We thought maybe it was from the engines or something we didn't know. We knew it was flying over, and we were actually looking for the shuttle passing by. We had no idea. There are a lot of eyewitness comments to that extent. Now, NASA didn't say anything for a long while other than it gave an indication it thought something had happened and that the flight was overdue for its landing. It was, after all, on a long, if you will, glide pattern, if one can call it that, to the Florida landing spot. Then came word that NASA believed that the shuttle was down. Then came word NASA said the shuttle was down. Fate of the crew still unknown and unspoken officially by NASA. NASA then put out word that at least one piece of debris, what they believe is debris, was found at an undisclosed site in North Texas. What else?
As you pointed out, the shuttle was scheduled to land at 9:16 Eastern Time. Around 9 o'clock Eastern Time, NASA discovered that they had lost contact with the shuttle. At that point, we had the initial report from NASA, from Mission Control, saying we've lost contact, but the hope was this was a temporary thing and contact would be restored. But of course, that never happened. Bill Harwood, if I can bring you in just for a moment. We spoke of this earlier. Routinely, during that last approach by a space shuttle, what's going on at Mission Control?
They're all monitoring their data. You know, it's a computer-controlled descent on the Space Shuttle. It has 4 flight computers that are really doing all of the flying. The commander and the pilot are really along for the ride until the shuttle gets down to an altitude of about 50,000 feet when it's directly over the runway, basically. So at that altitude, everybody's sitting back watching the data, making sure that everything's working properly, and of course, occasionally checking in with the crew to chat with them and just make sure everything's going okay. So very calm. You know, the Mission Control Center is calm. The astronauts were probably enjoying the ride. They all say on Reentry it's a pretty spectacular ride. You get that bright plasma sheath, they call it, very superheated, brightly lighted incandescent air around the crew cabin of the Space Shuttle. It puts on quite a show. I'm sure they were all monitoring their instruments but enjoying that until whatever happened, happened. And of course, we still don't yet know what happened. But Russ, I've been listening to you talk. I want to add one thing. The telemetry stream from the shuttle, the data that gets radioed back to Mission Control automatically by the flight computers, I would be very surprised at this point if they don't have some idea what happened. When they're comfortable enough to share that with us, of course, we don't know. But there is simply so much data coming down. I don't believe that whatever happened could have simply happened with no warning. I believe there's probably information buried in that data, and by now they may well have some inkling of what happened.
Bill Harwood, Dan Rather, stick in here with us, but we have an urgent just moved on the wires from the Associated Press. Dateline, Nacogdoches, Texas, an old Indian trading post, one of the oldest settled areas anywhere in Texas, deep behind what's sometimes called the pine tree curtain down there. Dateline, Nacogdoches, residents say debris, including bits of machinery and bits of metal, have been found strewn across the city. That's Nacogdoches early this morning, hours after NASA lost contact with Space Shuttle Columbia. James Milford, the owner of the local barbershop in downtown Nacogdoches, right around the square there, says, it's all over Nacogdoches, the debris. There are several little pieces, some parts of machinery. There's been a lot of pieces about 3 feet wide, unquote. That's in Nacogdoches. NASA declared an emergency after losing communication with Columbia as the ship soared across Texas at an altitude of about 200,000 feet while traveling, and keep this in mind, traveling at 6 times the speed of sound. At that speed and at that altitude, any even small thing going wrong in a spacecraft can be disastrous. So what we have here is apparent confirmation that large parts of the debris are spread over an area of deep East Texas in and around Nacogdoches, Corsicana, stretching over toward the Louisiana line. As we still await the news conference from NASA, this photograph you see in the encircled part, the Space Shuttle as it was coming down. This is a satellite photograph taken for meteorological purposes, but it shows you that streak in the left-hand corner of the screen of the shuttle coming down. And Bill Harwood, you've made this point repeatedly during the morning, but again, I'm keeping in mind so many people are joining us in progress, that because the Space Shuttle has short wings for kind of stability, people tend to think of it in terms of an aircraft, but in fact, if anything goes wrong and it begins to drop, there's no joy in saying this, it really drops like a stone.
It really does, Dan. You know, when they line up on final approach, like everyone is familiar with seeing when they're getting ready to land on the runway, they come in at almost a 20-degree angle. I mean, that's 7 times larger than a commercial airliner because it has to keep its speed up. The wings, these short, stubby wings, don't give it the lift of a full-size aircraft, and so it really does drop like a rock. I've heard it described as flying a brick. I've flown the shuttle in the simulator at the Johnson Space Center before, and it has that sense to it. You really are it looks like you're flying straight down when you're on the flight deck of that thing. It's impressive. And Dan, I wanted to point out one thing from what you were saying a few moments ago about the debris. You know, traveling at 12,500 miles per hour at an altitude of over 200,000 feet, I'd be very surprised if the footprint, they call it, the area where the debris lands, isn't spread out over a pretty wide area. And of course, I think one of the big concerns right now, Dan, is recovering or finding the crew module. That crew module on the Space Shuttle, the area right up here between the nose and the start of the payload bay, was actually designed to withstand 20 Gs, 20 times the force of Earth's gravity. In the case of the Challenger accident, the crew module pretty much stayed intact until it got to the ground. I'm certainly not suggesting this will help the crew, but if the crew has in fact perished, they obviously would like to recover the bodies for the family members, and as well as part of the investigation, and I'm sure that's another thing they're going to really be focusing on today.
Bill, let's talk about that debris. NASA has advised residents of North Texas, if you see any of this debris, don't touch it. What kind of materials are we talking about here?
Really rocket fuel primarily, although there's other materials on board that are dangerous too. But when the shuttle is in orbit, it has quite a few thrusters in the nose area and in the back that use hypergolic fuels, they're called. That's a rocket science word. It just simply means when you put them together, they burn. You don't need a spark plug. It makes for a simple engine design. But those hypergolic fuels are extremely toxic. If you breathe it, if you even get some of it on your skin, it can cause serious problems. So I think NASA's just playing it safe. If any small tanks of this material survive to reach the ground, if the shuttle did in fact break up at altitude, they're just telling people to stay away from it, and it is extremely dangerous. Bill,
Dan, if you'll hold on for just a second, I do want to get right back to you. But let's go quickly again to the White House and CBS News correspondent Mark Knoller. Mark, has the president arrived back at the White House, and are you getting any flow of information there? Well, unfortunately, we're not even getting audio out of Mark Knoller, so we can't know whether he's getting any flow of information or not. These things happen with live television. Let's go back to Bill Harwood. Bill, there are going to be people say, in fact, some no doubt are saying it already, you know, there's something inherently wrong with the U.S. manned space program because, quote, we keep having these accidents. Number one, it's not true that we keep having these accidents, that the Challenger explosion in 1986 was the last, disaster that we had before today. But there's also the question of, well, the Russians have had a very active space program, manned space program. Do they have these kind of accidents?
Dan, you know, it's interesting. I think people lose sight of what a reliable spacecraft the shuttle is. This was the 113th mission, and they've had one failure. No other major rocket system in the world has a record that good. The Russians, of course, have a good launch record, but remember, their whole space program has been based on going to a space station. They only launch rockets every 6 months or so. NASA's been launching the shuttle 5 or 6 times a year and doing it with remarkable success. It is a high-risk venture. You know, in the journalism world, you know, when something becomes routine or seemingly so, people stop thinking about that level of risk, but it's always been there. You know, at launch, that thing weighs 4.5 million pounds when it's loaded with fuel, and it goes from 0 to 100 miles an hour straight up in 10 seconds. At the end of 8.5 minutes, when it gets to orbit, it's going 8 times faster than the bullet from an assault rifle. That's an amazing thing that we all lose sight of. And then when it returns to Earth, it goes 25 times the speed of sound and then glides to a landing at 200 miles down the runway. That will always be risky, regardless of the rocket system.
Bill, dateline again, Nacogdoches, Texas, which is the central city in southeast Texas, in deep east Texas. The Nacogdoches police spokesman, Greg Sowell, says that there were several reports of falling debris in Nacogdoches. That's about 135 miles northeast of Houston. He did not know exactly how many reports there were of citizens calling in saying they'd seen debris in and around Nacogdoches. Nacogdoches has enacted its emergency operations center and is sending emergency crews to the reported debris. According to the police spokesman in the Texas city, at this point, we're just trying to get it out to the public to not touch or tamper with this debris. And we've said it before, we're going to say it again to anyone. You must not, absolutely must not touch or tamper with this debris. Number one, there's all kinds of toxicity, which is to say really hurtful stuff on some of this debris. And number two, of course, anytime you touch the debris, you run the risk of making it more difficult for investigators to find out exactly why this disaster happened this morning. I do want to mention that while we said some time ago that NASA was trying to put together a news conference for 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central, NASA emphasized at the time, don't hold us to that precise time. That press conference by NASA, in which we hope to find out a great deal more about what happened this morning, has been delayed. There's no word yet on a new time. When that news conference happens, you of course will see and hear it here at CBS News. Now, we have another person who says they're an eyewitness. Andrea Robinson is in the CBS News Bureau in Dallas. Miss Robinson, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Could you tell us exactly what you saw, when you saw it, and how you saw it?
Well, I knew the space shuttle was going to be going overhead at 8:03 Dallas time, and I was laying in bed and I heard the house shake, and I was half asleep, so I thought it was my daughter playing gymnastics upstairs. So then she came down and she said, "Mom, did you hear the house shake and the boom?" And I said, "Yeah, I thought it was you." And she said, "No, it wasn't." I said, "Well, the space shuttle is supposed to be going overhead." She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" So we ran outside. I live on the golf course in Las Colinas, Texas, and we saw the trail coming down. And it was a real wide trail. And at that time I was thinking, that's really strange that the trail is coming down from the sky instead of going across. But I really didn't know anything about, I had never seen the space shuttle before, so I just kind of left it at that. And then I came in the house and my friend called and she said, "Turn on the news." And I said, "Oh yes, the space shuttle was supposed to be going over and we just saw the trail." And she said, "No, it just exploded," and we were just devastated.
Robinson, I want to ask you, you mentioned that you knew that the space shuttle would be coming right over the house. You know, there's been a theory for a long time that Americans lost interest in the whole space program, even the manned space program. But what you said indicates to me that you and your daughter were very much aware of what was happening in the program and when it was happening.
Yes, they announced it on the local news that if you wanted to see the space shuttle that you would be able to at 8:03 Dallas time. So I was going to get my whole family up, but you know, it was Saturday morning and I was just a little bit behind schedule.
We thank you very much for being with us, Ms. Robinson.
You're welcome. Thank you.
We're holding for a potential NASA news conference, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, as soon as they can put together facts, so important in these circumstances. As soon as they can put together some facts, they intend to hold a news conference. The space shuttle is definitely down, pieces of it over southeast Texas. Debris found, what is said to be debris found in Nacogdoches, Texas, deep in East Texas. NASA has acknowledged the shuttle is down. NASA says it has a search mission underway. The fate of the astronauts officially unstated and officially unknown. However, unofficially, NASA has lowered the flag to half-staff next to the launch site in Florida. And that there is a report that a piece of debris sparked a fire at an apartment building in Plano, that's just north of Dallas, Texas. We have not absolutely confirmed that apartment fire was caused by debris. It's believed that it was. Let's go to Ed Crawley, who's chairman of the MIT Aeronautics Department. He's at our CBS News station in Boston, Massachusetts. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Crawley.
Good morning, Dan.
What can you tell us about this situation to put it in context, to give it some perspective?
Well, as has been pointed out, Dan, it's early in this series of events, and as you commented some time ago, the things we learn early are often not the final facts. But what we know so far is that this was the 107th flight of the Space Shuttle. There have been 88 successful flights, including in the last few years a spectacular series of successes that have gone to the space station as part of its assembly sequence. We've seen the video a number of times, and the video tends to indicate, as I watch it, that something broke off the shuttle early. The shuttle then went along for some time, and then there was a more dramatic event which indicates a loss of attitude control of the shuttle. It then seems to break up into a number of pieces and then begin to descend.
I want to point out that Ed Crawley, who's speaking to us from our CBS affiliate WBZ, great news television station in Boston, Massachusetts, is an engineer. He worked at the Johnson Space Center and helped train the Columbia mission astronauts. Mr. Crawley, it's Dr. Crawley, isn't it?
That would be fine.
Dr. Crawley, you've done well in putting this in an overall perspective. Let's review why this mission went. What was it that they sought to accomplish in space?
Well, this mission was one of a string of missions to the space station. There was some resupply. There was some science performed on this mission. This is one in which visiting crew, as the Israeli astronaut in this case, often go and participate in. It's a sortie up to the space station for resupply and provisioning, and as well as the conduct of intermediate science objectives over the course of the stay on orbit, about 2 weeks.
Dr. Crawley, you mentioned earlier, while emphasizing we simply don't know what happened.
That's right.
And I think fair to say we're not likely to know what happened for a very long time, if ever, given the fact, and it now appears to be a fact, that debris is spread over at least parts of southeast Texas, east of Dallas and north of Houston, and possibly on into Louisiana. But you mentioned a couple of things I want you to go back over. You said that they're question areas. No one is saying that we conclude that these caused what happened today, but you said there are a couple of questionable areas. Could you go back over those for review for us, please?
Well, the NASA team will immediately freeze the data at JSC. They have a very well-established procedure for freezing all the information that they have so as to have the best possible chance of recovering the sequence of events that led to this tragedy. Now, unfortunately, because this was at a time when the spacecraft was just at reentry interface, where it was just entering the top layer of the atmosphere, this is a time of maximum heating, and the aerodynamic pressure is building on the spacecraft. And this period is characterized always, even on a normal flight, by a loss of transmission, a loss of signal from the spacecraft. So without having seen the telemetry yet, I suspect that one of the difficulties in reconstructing this will be that this was in a period with either reduced or no radio contact and reduced telemetry. They'll have, of course, ground track information and so forth.
Well, while we await what we believe will be a NASA news conference at some point, it's already been delayed from the hoped-for time of about 20, 21 minutes ago. We were talking to Dr. Ed Crawley, who's with MIT, the Aeronautics and Aeronautics Chairman at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Crawley, there were two things in the sequence of events involving this shuttle mission that now raise at least a question mark in one's mind, and I want you to put these in context for us. First of all, a crack was discovered on Shuttle Discovery, not on this shuttle, but on another shuttle, and because that, you know, I think we're talking about a very small crack was discovered, all the shuttles were then investigated for cracks, and this mission was given a go-ahead. Is that the kind of thing that investigators will be looking at, or is that too far back?
Well, Dan, one of the things the NASA team will do in the next hours and days is collect all the information they have, the information from pre-flight inspections, from the launch telemetry and videos, and start to identify what they call potential root causes. Any recent crack or damage like this they see will certainly be on that list, as will be the potential for an explosion on board the spacecraft on the orbiter, as will be the potential for a failure of the thermal protection system. And this is the time of flight when the thermal protection system is most important. These three things, any immediate previous defects, and a possibility of an explosion and a loss of the thermal protection system, the insulation literally around the spacecraft, will be at the top of their list to follow as leads.
Now, what about the report? It wasn't just a report that after this shuttle had been launched, there was some concern about a piece of insulation, it's my understanding, a small piece of insulation, perhaps unaccounted for after the fuel tank so necessary for the launch itself came off. Do you know anything about that? And is that not the kind of thing, or is it, that they'll also be looking into?
Well, I don't know the specifics of this case, but let me explain what happens, which is the tank, the large tank on which the orbiter is actually attached, has a thermal protection system of its own, mostly to keep it cool before launch. Of course, in the launch sequence, the tank is separated and falls into the Indian Ocean, so it's long gone. But if during the launch, during the maximum aerodynamic forces that occur during launch, a piece of that insulation fell off, as I have also heard reported this morning, and impacted the thermal protection system, the famous tiles that we remember from the early days of the shuttle, if a piece of the insulation fell off and impacted the tiles, that would be a point of suspicion that the NASA investigators would follow up very quickly as to whether that led to a series of events which subsequently could have caused a failure of that thermal protection system. Again, we have no idea at this point whether that's in fact the string of events, but it would certainly be on the list of early considerations they would look into.
Dr. Crawley, again, and I know you agree with this, at the risk of being redundant, we want to underscore nobody knows what caused this accident. How long might we anticipate the investigation to take?
Well, in the next few days, there will be a decision whether NASA will be charged internally to conduct an investigation into these events, or whether more of a presidential blue ribbon panel, as we had in the case of the Challenger accident, will be commissioned. I think that's something that in the next few days you'll hear from the White House, whether they have confidence that NASA will be able to do this and be charged, or whether a larger national inquiry will be caused. A lot of the time scale of what happens next depends on that decision. If it's an internal NASA investigation, it will likely go months. The Challenger investigation went years. We have had 3 now accidents in our spacefaring history, American history, of a human loss, and on average, the last 2 have run about 18 to 20 months as the scope of the investigation.
We're talking to Dr. Ed Crawley of Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Crawley, stay with us for a second, because I want to share with you and our viewers that Bill Harwood, our CBS man on the scene at NASA in Florida, says that Sean O'Keefe, who is the NASA administrator, will hold a press conference now. NASA is hoping at 1 p.m. Eastern time. That would be 12 noon in the Central Time Zone. Yes, previously NASA said it was hoping to hold a news conference as early as 11:30 Eastern Time. I now repeat for emphasis, and of course our CBS News coverage will continue straight on. The NASA administrator will hold a news conference hopefully at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and at that time we may learn more, although I don't think anyone should anticipate learning a whole lot more. You just never know, but one wouldn't want to build expectations too high, because NASA is still, the whole National Aeronautics and Space Administration is in a state of shock about this disaster that has happened with the Space Shuttle. And also, Dateline Cape Canaveral, Florida, a senior U.S. official says Space Shuttle is, quote, gone. You can say, well, didn't we already know that? But the fact of the matter is that we have not had a senior U.S. official from Cape Canaveral, he's unidentified, but saying that flatly, saying that the Space Shuttle is, quote, gone. We've reported to you previously that various people in and around Nacogdoches, Texas now report finding debris, many reports of debris over the city. We have not confirmed that what these people say they see is in fact debris, but there's so many reports from Nacogdoches confirmed by the police department, people calling from, quote, all over town, in that East Texas city, that it seems highly probable that what these people are seeing is in fact debris. We'll go back to Dr. Crawley, and I really appreciate your time, Doctor. There are now only 3 Space Shuttle vehicles left. Is it likely any new ones will be built? And if any new ones are not built, is the whole program in some kind of mortal danger?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Dan, and it's obviously a little early to weigh in on that. The last space shuttle, the one that replaced the Challenger, was commissioned in about 1987 or 8 and finished in the late 80s or maybe 1990. And it was built using some spare parts that had remained from the original construction. They had essentially laid in some spares. It's now been about 13 or 14 years since that time, and I think it would be unlikely that NASA would try to commission the construction of another orbiter at this time. Still too early to say. NASA has just completed a reprogramming of its efforts to replace the shuttle, which involved building sort of an intermediate space plane, mostly to transport crew to orbit and back to go to the space station, and delaying the development until the next decade of a fully reusable replacement for the shuttle. I suspect what's more likely to happen is this series of events will cause Sean O'Keefe, the NASA administrator, and his team to re-examine those recent decisions and see if the timing and pace of that replacement schedule is still appropriate.
Dr. Willy, from MIT, if you'll stick with us, please. Well, we have some news to pass along. Just a moment ago, we reported Dateline Cape Canaveral that a senior U.S. official says that Space Shuttle is, quote, gone. There has still been no official word from NASA, keeping in mind that NASA now says that it hopes to hold a news conference at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 12 Central. But this same senior U.S. official says there is no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. Let me repeat that for emphasis. A senior U.S. official says the space shuttle is, quote, gone. He says there's no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. Let's pause for a moment to absorb that, and let's put up the picture of the heroes. Russ Mitchell will read the names of those aboard the shuttle as the word comes from a senior U.S. official that they and the shuttle are gone.
Commander of the flight, Colonel Rick Husband. This was his second mission, as you can see there, 45 years old, from Amarillo, Texas. Lieutenant Colonel William McCool was the mission pilot. This was his first mission, 41 years old. His hometown is San Diego, California. And as we're going to see here, these folks come from around the country and around the world. David Brown, Commander David Brown, was the mission specialist, 46 years old, from Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. His first mission. Commander Laurel Clark, a doctor, Dr. Laurel Clark, commander, first mission, 46 years old, from Racine, Wisconsin. Kalpana Chawla, engineer, aerospace engineer, her first mission, 41 years old. She was born in Karnal, India, but she became a citizen of the United States. Michael Anderson, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Anderson, mission specialist. This was his second mission, 42 years old. He's from out west, Spokane, Washington. Ilan Ramon, Colonel Ramon, from Tel Aviv, Israel, his first mission, 48 years old. He was part of this NASA program to involve more countries in the U.S. space program. Because of him, his nationality being from Israel, security was beefed up on this flight. However, there is no official word from anyone, as we've been reporting this morning, as to what may have happened here. And the thought of terrorism, while not been completely ruled out by the White House, certainly is being seen as something that is not a possibility, not very much of a possibility. And there we are once again, the 7 astronauts, 6 Americans, and 1 Israeli citizen.
And 2 of those astronauts are American women. Let's go to Bill Harwood in Florida. Bill, if you're there, bring us up to date on what you're hearing, what you've learned.
Yes, Dan, I'm here. No real change yet. The flight controllers, of course, are still looking over the data. As you say, NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, new on the job, just appointed recently, is obviously faced with his biggest challenge. I'm not even sure the right word to pick for this, is going to address the media and the nation, really, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. But no word yet on what might have caused this or what the impact might be.
Bill Harwood, as you sit there from your vantage point earlier, you told us you looked out the window and the flags are flying at half-staff. What other activity can you see there from where you are?
None at all, Russ. This is a Saturday at the Space Center. The only people that would come in today is the landing team. They were all out at the runway, which is a little distance from here, and of course in what they call the firing room, just over my right shoulder, the launch control center, if you will, is where the people are. Behind me, of course, is the launch pad that Columbia took off on January the 16th when this flight began 16 days ago. And as you say, when they rolled out and lowered that flag to half staff, that was a terrible sight to see, very reminiscent of what happened on January the 28th, 1986, when they lowered the flag, and that was the first sign at all that we had that NASA thought the crew was lost.
Bill, Commander Rick Husband had just one other space flight under his belt. How and why did he become the commander of this mission?
That happens, depends on the merit of the flyer, Dan. A lot of times commanders, their second flight, their commander. And of course, in the early days of the program, when they didn't have a lot of flights and an experienced astronaut base, the commanders were first-time flyers. So that in and of itself was not unusual at all. Before any flight, it's estimated that the commander and the pilot do more than 1,000 approaches to a runway in NASA's shuttle training aircraft, which is a business jet that they've rigged up to handle just like a space shuttle on final approach. It has the same instrumentation. You wears the spacesuit. It's just like landing the real thing. More than 1,000 of those per flight. So I don't think there's any concern at all about his competence or technical ability. And plus, at that phase of the entry, Dan, the computer's flying under the control of its computers, the shuttle, I should say. They don't take over manual control until they get to an altitude of about 50,000 feet, and that doesn't happen until just a few minutes before actual landing. So they were sitting there watching their instruments as this whatever happened, and not actively involved in flying the shuttle at that point.
Well, Bill, let me make explicitly clear and underscore that the thrust of the question was not that Commander Husband in any way
completely understand.
Was not prepared. An Air Force colonel from Amarillo, you have to know, we do know, that he was prepared by long hours, grueling hours of preparation. But I seem to recall, I may be wrong about this, that the original commander for this mission got ill or something. Perhaps I'm wrong about that.
No, we had a couple of flights last year where some crew members got replaced. One space station crew member got replaced at the last minute because of illness, and the pilot of a shuttle mission late last year had to be replaced again because of an illness issue. But in this case, Rick Husband's been commander assigned to this flight since I think 2001, as I recall. He's been in training for this mission all along.
Well, and let's have no doubt that on the word of the NASA official who says not only is the space shuttle gone, but the crew is gone, that Commander Husband and others, all others in the crew, died heroes. Quickly giving you a look at the situation at the moment, NASA has scheduled a news conference for now 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 12 in the Central Time Zone. NASA declared an emergency after losing contact with the crew and sent search teams to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and now search teams are headed more to the east in East Texas. Ed Rohner, who's Nacogdoches, Texas airport manager, has said that some type of tank ended up on his runway. He said, he's talking about some sort of tank off an aircraft. Mr. Rohner also says that there are pieces of debris all along the entrance road to the Nacogdoches airport. National Guardsmen have been called out to protect the debris. A search for debris is underway throughout the area east and north of Dallas, stretching on into at least parts of Louisiana. Gary Hunzinger of Plano, Texas, said that he saw the shuttle flying overhead. He said he saw two bright objects flying off each side of it. He thought that they might be some sort of pursuit aircraft at first, but of course the shuttle was flying at 200,000 feet plus, so there could be no other aircraft up there. Benjamin Laster of Kemp, Texas, says his barn started shaking, and he and his family ran out and started looking around. Laster said he saw a puff of vapor and smoke and a big chunk of material fall. And the situation at this hour is that a senior U.S. government official says the space shuttle is, quote, gone. This same official says there's no hope for either the shuttle or its crew of 7. The next event, in terms of which we hope to have some official information to get perhaps additional facts on this disaster, scheduled for 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And Russ, I'm reminded that Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, in his speech to the nation on the day the shuttle Challenger exploded, killing all 7 of its astronauts, quoted the following: "The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God," unquote. President Ronald Reagan with the Space Challenger eulogy back in the mid-1980s.
In fact, it was January 28th, 1986.
Bill Harwood, if you're still with us in Florida, this is a picture of the shuttle Challenger exploding. Sometimes on television it's difficult to tell what's today and what's yesterday. This was the shuttle Challenger exploding just after the commander had given the full throttle forward. 73 seconds into the flight, it exploded and crashed to Earth. Quite a different situation today. These are the old Challenger explosion pictures. Today we have only a few photographs from today high in the sky, but this was on descent. The first time that shuttle has had difficulty, certainly anything approaching this kind of difficulty on descent. Now these are pictures from today. Bill, I was going to ask that, keeping in mind that the Challenger shuttle exploded on January 28, 1986, and then this happens in early February. Will or will not, one of the things to be looking into is there something especially dangerous we didn't know about with shuttle launches in deep winter, even though they're in Florida?
Well, Dan, I think in this case, I wouldn't think that at all. The temperatures here when the shuttle took off and leading up to launch, you folks up in New York would probably consider balmy. It got a little chilly for us, but it wasn't anywhere near a level that would affect a piece of aircraft equipment or even the space shuttle. I don't think, in this case, wintertime was an issue at all. I think this was, whatever happened today was a mechanical failure of some sort that took place, and I think the timing is purely coincidental.
Bill, the Columbia was up at 200,000, more than 200,000 feet today when they lost contact with mission control. At what point, at what altitude, potentially does weather become a factor?
Oh, they have to get much, much lower in the atmosphere for that to happen. Remember, in a commercial airliner, or even the Concorde, which flies up to 60,000 feet or so, 50 or 60,000 feet, they're up above 99% of the weather. I mean, there's not much above 60,000 feet, maybe a little bit, but not much, and certainly nothing along Columbia's track. Well, weather becomes an issue when they get down in the manual flying range of 50,000 feet or so. They get there just a few minutes before landing, literally in sight of the runway when they get to that point. And as a matter of fact, they were worried about winds aloft a little earlier today. At that point, when the commander, Rick Husband, would have taken over manual control to guide the shuttle, but certainly nothing at 200,000 feet that would be an impact. I can't imagine what it could be.
Bill Harwood, stick with us down in Florida, if you will. We want to recap now very quickly for those of you who may have joined us in progress. The Associated Press is quoting a senior U.S. official as saying now the Space Shuttle Columbia, quote, is gone. That same official is quoted as saying that there are no survivors among the astronauts. A NASA news conference is now scheduled for 1 o'clock Eastern Time, 12 noon Central Time, about today's developments. Mission Control lost contact with the shuttle just minutes before land this morning at 9:16 Eastern Time at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Get the picture. It was in rapid descent over North Texas, headed for Florida. It was due to land in just a matter of minutes, given the speed it was traveling. When eyewitnesses said they looked up, saw it in the sky, and then saw what obviously was some breakup. NASA immediately declared an emergency, scrambled rescue crews from the Dallas-Fort Worth area and elsewhere, and others are now heading toward eastern Texas. Shuttle debris, what's described as shuttle debris, has been found in southeast Texas in the Corsicana, Nacogdoches area. A lot of it is reported to be in and around Nacogdoches. There's also a report that a piece of debris sparked a fire at an apartment building in Plano, just north of Dallas, Texas. That's being checked and double-checked to see, in fact, whether that fire was started by some kind of falling debris. NASA's put out a public advisory to people in Texas and elsewhere to avoid any possibly hazardous debris that may have come from the space shuttle. We're going to say again, some of this debris is toxic. If you're in an area, and when we said in East Texas and elsewhere, possibly there's some debris, possibly, carefully over the Texas-Louisiana line. If you're in any place where you think you have seen some of this debris, stay clear of it, stay away from it. President Bush, who was at Camp David in Maryland, is on his way back to the White House and is receiving updates. The flag next to NASA's countdown clock has been lowered to half staff. There were 7 astronauts aboard, including 6 Americans, along with the first Israeli astronaut. Partly because of his presence, security surrounding this mission was tight, but a spokesman for the Homeland Security Department said flatly this morning, there's absolutely, positively no indication that this even could have been a terrorist incident or that there was any foul play involved. Now, on the phone now from New Mexico, we have Colonel Mike Mullane, former shuttle astronaut on 3 missions. He was once aboard Shuttle Discovery, twice on Shuttle Atlantis. Colonel Mullane, thank you for being with us.
Good morning, Dan.
Since you've been there, and so few humans ever have, describe for us, as the shuttle is reaching that point where it's in what's been described as the glide pattern over North Texas, what the astronauts are feeling and what they're doing at that moment.
Well, when we come out of orbit, we actually start half a world away from our landing site. We turn the orbiter around and fire deorbit motors for a couple of minutes to slow us down, and then turn the orbiter back forward, lift the nose up so that the belly is presented to the atmosphere. We're coming in about 40 degrees nose high, and of course you got the heat tiles on the belly that are protecting you. Initially, for the first, probably a good 20 or 30 minutes, you really don't feel much or see much. The air is so thin up there, we're falling through it. It's around when you start getting down around that 250,000 foot point, you start getting this white hot air wrapped around you. You're in the cockpit looking out. It's a fantastic light show. You can see this white hot glow of this superheated air around the cockpit. And the shuttle is just doing these roll maneuvers as it loses energy as it falls toward the landing site. It is a autopilot reentry. The pilot can take control at any point. It's a hot stick, they grab the stick and they have control of it. But there's no reason to do that because you can't see the runway anyway, so you might as well just let the autopilot fly it. So a nominal reentry, it would be on autopilot. The crew would be sitting there monitoring the hydraulic system, monitoring the navigation system. The reentries that I had were very benign, very quiet. Get a little bit shaken when you get deeper into the atmosphere, but it's not like launch. Launch is a much more dynamic event, and reentry is much more quiet and stable.
Colonel Mullane, what is the gravest danger on reentry as one has done it 3 times? Tell us what the greatest danger is.
Well, obviously, you're going from 5 miles per second in speed, 18,000 miles an hour, and you're up around 200 miles, and you've got to dissipate all of that energy, all of that speed, and the potential energy, they call it the altitude. You have to get all that down to 0 altitude and 0 speed after a 12,000 mile glide halfway around the world. And obviously, there's lots of things that could go wrong on something like that. Hydraulic failures, you're dependent upon the hydraulic system to operate these flight controls on the shuttle. When you get deeper in the atmosphere and higher up, you're dependent on steering jets to fire to maintain the attitude. The shuttle has to enter very, very precisely. It can't. It's not like a fighter jet that you can just kind of fly around at different attitudes. It's has to come in the atmosphere to very close tolerances in attitude, or else aerodynamic failure could occur. It could pitch out of control and be destroyed. And what would cause that? Obviously, NASA will be looking at that. There's many different things that could happen: failure of the steering jets, structural failure, data processing. I mean, the heart of the machine is a computer. If you have problems with it, there's 4 of them. It's unlikely all of them would fail, but I mean, you could have some type of software error or computer problem that would pitch the vehicle out of control. I mean, there's many, many different things that could fail that would cause this reentry to become a disaster. And NASA, I'm sure, is going to be looking at every possible detail that would cause a problem like that.
Colonel Mullane, when the Space Shuttle first re-enters, and it goes into what's called the aura phase, where you have this strange, mysterious light around it, and then you emerge from that. As an astronaut, were you thinking of possible death?
Well, I have to admit that launch is what most terrified me. People ask me, was I scared on a shuttle launch? And I tell them, no, I wasn't scared. I was terrified. And I flew 3 times. I was terrified on the first launch, I was terrified on the second launch, and I was terrified on the third launch. I have to admit that in orbit, it's very relaxing. I didn't ever feel like my life was imminently at risk when I was in space. And reentry, you get your heart rate up a little bit, but again, I always felt like the chances of something bad happening on reentry are much less than they are on launch. I mean, on launch, it's a controlled explosion. I mean, you're converting 4 million pounds of propellant in just 8.5 minutes to a speed of 18,000 miles an hour and an altitude of 100 miles or so. That's a huge energy exchange, and obviously a lot of bad things can happen on launch. And so I was much more apprehensive on my launches than I ever was on my reentry. The reentry is very, it's not. It just doesn't have that dynamic about it, not the noise and the shaking and the violence that you have on liftoff and on orbit insertion launch.
But you said, Colonel Mulhane, that on re-entry, that I think your words were, it gets your heart beat up a little. Is the translation of that your heart's pounding like a hammer?
Well, it's certainly, it is very, not very, but it is much more apprehensive. You're much more apprehensive on re-entry than you are in orbit. Orbit is relaxing. I mean, assuming everything's going fine, again, I never had any sense that my life was threatened in space. I know that sounds bizarre probably to a lot of people when you consider you're in a vacuum and you're hundreds of miles above the Earth, but it was very relaxing. On re-entry, you do get more apprehensive, but it's not the same as launch. At least it wasn't for me. Now, I realized that things could go bad on re-entry, but again, I just didn't have the sense of threat that I did on launch.
Colonel, we're going to put up again the crew photograph for this mission. And as we put that photograph up, I want you to tell us briefly, if you will, what it takes, how much it takes to be an astronaut.
Well, I didn't know any of the people that were lost today on Columbia. I left in 1990. Challenger obviously affected us, my group, because there were 4 from Challenger were killed from my group. All astronauts, I think that it's a passion. It's something that you want to do so badly that you can't turn away from it. It's something in your blood. I think that describes most astronauts. In fact, I've told people before that I think the fear of not making the trip far exceeds the fear of dying doing it. I know that sounds bizarre, but I think people who climb like mountains and Mount Everest and these other people that do these things, that it always amazes me. I'm not a mountain climber. It always amazes me that, how in the world do these people do this, climb up to Mount Everest? And then I think about it. I know how they do it. To them, it's a passion. They have to do it. And that's,
I think we lost the audio of Colonel Mulhane from New Mexico as he was speaking so eloquently about what it is, what it takes to be an astronaut, what it drives those who have this passion to go into space, as the crew of this shuttle mission did. Well, Dateline, the Kennedy Space Center, quote, "It's gone." That's what a senior U.S. official says about Space Shuttle Columbia. The shuttle broke apart in flames on its way to landing. All 7 astronauts on board were killed. The official says debris strewn across Texas and apparently some other states has been positively identified now as being from the shuttle. That's why this official can say it's gone, the shuttle, and that all 7 astronauts on board were killed. There is yet to be any official word from NASA, but this high U.S. government source says there is no hope for either the shuttle or its 7-member crew. That yes, we've known that in our hearts and intellectually, I guess for us, since sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock Eastern Time. But to hear someone in a position of authority say it, it hits the heart like a sledge. NASA Chief Sean O'Keefe is meeting with the astronauts' families. A nation's sympathy goes to them, and condolences, of course. The families had been waiting at Florida's Kennedy Space Center for this morning's scheduled landing, what they hoped would be, what they believed would be a triumphal return. And the news conference is scheduled for 1 o'clock Eastern Time. Television footage has been various television footage showing the bright light of the space shuttle over Texas, followed by plumes of smoke streaking through the sky. Debris seemed to break off into separate balls of light. All of this happened just after 9 a.m. this morning, Eastern Time, when the shuttle was just minutes from landing in Florida. You know, Russ Mitchell, they sometimes say after dangerous trips that the most dangerous time is the closest you get to home. And so it was today with Shuttle Columbia.
The debris is falling throughout north central Texas. Nacogdoches, Texas seems to be an area where a lot of debris is coming down. Right now we want to talk to the city manager there, Victoria La Follette. Did I say your name right, Victoria?
La Follette, yes,
La
sir.
Follette. Thank you very much for joining us. We certainly appreciate it. What is going on in your town this morning as we speak this morning, Central Time?
Well, obviously, we are in emergency operations mode. We've activated an emergency management center, and we're coordinating with state and federal officials as we begin to assess how much debris we have in our particular area. We do have considerable debris in Nacogdoches.
What are people saying to you that they are discovering?
Pardon me?
What are people discovering in Nacogdoches? What kind of pieces of debris do they think they're spotting?
All sorts of pieces. We've had pieces on our runway at the airstrip. We've had pieces in roadways. We've had pieces on top of buildings. We've had it on people's roofs, in yards and fields, all sorts of sizes and shapes.
Ms. La Follette, there are reports that some buildings have caught on fire in Nacogdoches as a result of the debris coming down. What can you tell us about that?
We have no fires. We've had some damage to some buildings, but some of the debris that we were told that came down was still hot, but we have not had any major fires of any kind.
Mm-hmm. What are you telling residents about this?
We are very concerned about people touching any of the debris. We have told them do not touch it, leave it alone. We're asking them to notify us at 911. We are having to catalog and keep up with where all the pieces are located. And so we're having people contact us to give us that information, and then in turn we're sharing that with the appropriate state and federal officials.
We understand that some of this debris may in fact be toxic. What are you hearing from NASA or from officials about what kind of materials we're talking about here?
The last that we've heard, we don't believe there's any radioactive materials. There are some chemicals that we are concerned about, and we are working through the Texas Department of Health to get more information out on that. If for some reason someone has come in contact with, we're telling them, for the time being, to please, wash their hands with soap and water, anything they may have touched immediately. And
I'm sorry, ma'am, go ahead.
And that's the main thing, the thing we definitely want to get out. We do not want people touching anything. If it's in a roadway or something, take a shovel or something and push it out of the way, but do not touch it.
Okay. Victoria La Follette. I'm sorry, Dan, have a question from Mr.
Russ, no, but we do thank you, ma'am, for being with us this morning. John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent, is at the White House where they've been at least an informal briefing. John, what have they told you?
Well, good afternoon to you, Dan. President Bush arrived back here at the White House about a minute ago after the 90-minute trip from Camp David, where he was supposed to spend the weekend. The flags here at the White House just a few minutes ago were lowered to half-mast, and the president is expected this afternoon to make an address to the nation. It's quite possible that will be an address from the Oval Office. In a briefing a little while ago, we were told that President Bush talked personally to NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe. NASA has been designated the lead agency in the investigation, which the White House promises is going to be careful and thorough. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, was up at Camp David this morning. She preceded the president down here. She has been huddled with the National Security Secretary, or the Homeland Security Secretary, rather, Tom Ridge, who has talked with Governor Rick Perry of Texas to express his condolences and to coordinate recovery efforts. He's also talked with the governors of neighboring states to put them on alert because the debris field is so large. It's possible that the debris could have crossed state borders as well. There have been mid-level consultations so far between the United States government and the government of Israel, expresses of condolences for the loss of Ilan Ramon, the 48-year-old fighter pilot who was the first Israeli astronaut who was on board the Space Shuttle. And President Bush, now that he is back at the White House, expected to consult with his top advisors, and it's expected that he will be making a personal telephone call to Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon to express his condolences personally. So what to see from the White House later on today is an address from the President, most likely from the Oval Office. But Dan, I should say that people around here are just stunned trying to make sense of what happened. These things are typically routine. The most that anybody watches for is the two sonic booms as the shuttle re-enters the atmosphere and puts on that show, and then of course the landing. No one ever thought that anything like this could happen because there's just been no sense that the re-entries have been anything but routine. But as Bill Harwood was talking about earlier today, 200,000 feet, 12,500 miles per hour. There's a lot of dynamic pressure on that airframe, a lot of heat as it starts to come back into the atmosphere. And it's obvious that something went terribly, terribly wrong. There's been no indication from anyone here at the White House that there was any kind of terrorism involved. In fact, quite to the contrary, they say that there's nothing to suggest that it was terrorism. The shuttle was about 35 to 40 miles high, and short of an intercontinental ballistic missile, there's not much that would fly that high, Dan. So it's highly unlikely that there would have been anything from the ground that was involved. And of course, the security around the space shuttle, all of the systems are checked and triple checked. Highly unlikely that anything could have been brought on board that would have precipitated such an event. But this afternoon, the President will be addressing the nation, so we'll keep watching that here from the White House. Dan.
John Roberts at the White House. John mentioned that the President either has or will soon be expressing his condolences to the leaders and people of Israel, and of course he'll be expressing his condolences to the families of the other astronauts, all Americans, as we and the nation do and will be doing in the days that follow. On the telephone with us now, Dr. Don Puris, two-time shuttle astronaut, world-renowned astronomer. And Dr. Puris, and I do hope I pronounced your name correctly, you knew some of today's astronauts.
Well, I knew two of them, Dan. Rick Husband and Kalpana Chawla were acquaintances of mine, but of course, and I had met all of them. I had an experiment on this particular flight, and when the entire flight crew came to the Goddard Space Flight Center to receive some training on that experiment, I had met all of them during that period of time.
Dr. Puris, there will be the inevitable questions revived now about why do humans in space, why not do these experiments, why not do this exploration by robot? Why put humans in space? And this may be as good a time as any to at least briefly review why we have it as a national purpose to explore space with humans.
Well, there's more to it than just the experiments that we do in space. You know, it's certainly true that many of the experiments that are done in a human-tended manner on the space station or the space shuttle could have been done robotically. But on the other hand, as we look toward the distant future, humans have always been explorers, and if we think back in the Earth's history, in human history, at all of the changes that have occurred due to humans actually going and exploring places, whether it's Columbus making his way across the ocean to the United States, or any of the other early explorers that forged trade routes and so forth. Much of human history has been developed by the exploratory nature of us, and we continue to do that. So it's not only the narrow-sighted view of the particular experiments that could have been done on the ground instead of in space. it's a matter of gaining a lot of experience and gaining the ability for humans to extend their presence beyond the Earth.
As one who's done it twice, what drives people? What motivates one to want to be an astronaut and to go through the long, grueling training for just a chance that you'll be catapulted up there catapulted to the high frontier?
Well, I think it's the adventure and the excitement, the possibility of making some significant contribution to science and to the human capabilities in space, and it's exciting, and people like to do it. I don't know what else to say.
When you were aboard for reentry on the 2 flights, you were afraid. Can you tell us about that?
That part of the, well, the reentry is actually very, very smooth. It's not, you know, there's not a whole lot going on at that point, and particularly at the point where it appears that the Columbia first started having difficulties, that point is sort of the transition point where it's not flying so much like a spacecraft anymore, and it's flying more like an airplane as the atmospheric pressure outside builds sufficiently that the aerodynamic control surfaces start to become effective. That's sort of the transition region there, and it's not, you know, there's not a lot going on. It's hard to imagine what sort of a catastrophic failure could have occurred then to create what happened.
At that moment, when you were aboard the shuttle twice, at just about this time when you were over North Texas, were you thinking about possible death or thinking about we're just a few short minutes from home?
Well, I didn't fly over Texas. Both of my missions landed at Edwards Air Force Base, but nevertheless, at that point in the flight, maybe 15 minutes before landing, it's like you're on an airliner at that point, and I was certainly not thinking of death. I was thinking about getting a night's sleep because I had worked many hours before that and then had stayed up. Instead of going to bed as I would have normally been scheduled to in orbit, then I was staying up for the entry and landing and was tired and looking forward to seeing my family and getting a good night's sleep.
As no doubt were these astronauts today who are now gone. Thank you, Dr. Don Paris, 2-time shuttle astronaut who knew some of today's astronauts. What you've been seeing as we were talking to you, Dr. Paris, were pictures from our affiliate in Dallas. This debris, which has been, it's my understanding, confirmed as part of the shuttle's debris, was near Fort Worth, Texas. These aerial shots of the debris, and you can see how large a smoked and scorched area this is by seeing it in comparison to the people who are walking around it. This is from our Dallas CBS News affiliate, aerials of the debris on the ground. Now that was near Fort Worth, and there have been confirmed now reports of debris found in East Texas, which tells you how far an area this debris is strewn over. These are amateur pictures, this amateur photograph. This is the best photograph we've had. The shuttle was flying along at 200,000 feet plus.
Yes, you're right. This is the best video.
Incredible speed. And let's just let the pictures speak for themselves for a moment. As, of course, it plummeted through the Earth's atmosphere, it was burning. And this is the trail that it left. Our good friends in the director's booth will re-rack that video, I think, now. The amateur photographer had the shuttle, then saw sparking like a star, trailing vapor and smoke. Pieces are flying off. You can see them off to the side. And then the plummet to Earth. This, one of the debris sites near Fort Worth, Texas. And I was saying earlier, Russ Mitchell, that you see this debris site in Fort Worth, Texas, then hundreds of miles to the east near Nacogdoches, over in the general area of the Texas-Louisiana border, all kinds of reports of debris there. And NASA, I don't know officially, but people at NASA have emphasized that there may be debris, you know, as far as Louisiana, perhaps Arkansas. It's just that it's going to be spread over a very wide area, which, again, this is the third time, I think at least the third time, we're showing you this amateur video that was taken. I'm not quite sure from where this video was taken, somewhere in North Texas.
Also, again, authorities say if you come in contact with this, don't touch it. It could be very dangerous.
I think we want to go to Bill Harwood, our CBS News space expert, who's been so magnificent in reporting this story this morning. There's no other word that describes it. Before doing so, I think that we should re-rack that video one time. This is the best available evidence we have of what happened to the shuttle. And just let it play for a minute. Well, I was hoping that we could rack that from the top and let it play, but here it is.
Dan, this is Bill Harwood. Can you hear me?
Lump in your throat time. As the path of the shuttle to Earth is clear, we go down to Bill Harwood in Florida. Bill?
Dan, it's terrible to watch that. One thing that I'm struck by watching it, occasionally you can see a bright reddish flash. That's very characteristic of the kind of fuel the shuttle carries igniting. Hypergolic fuels, when they burn or when a launch blows up here from the Air Force on an unmanned rocket, they always talk about the big red cloud, and that's very indicative of fuel tanks on board the shuttle, maneuvering fuel tanks, coming apart in the atmosphere and the fuel igniting. That red flash is hardly you can't mistake it for anything else.
Bill Harwood.
Dan, if I could,
just
very quickly, I wanted to point out the only thing we've heard all morning, or even thinking about, that was out of the ordinary, is this foam from the external tank falling and hitting the leading edge of the left wing shortly after launch.
Bill, excuse me for interrupting, but
sure.
People will say foam on the tank. That foam was to insulate for the heat?
That's exactly right. You know, these are super cold propellants, hundreds of degrees below zero, and the orange look of the tank, the actual outer few inches of the tank, is a foam insulation that looks orange. A piece fell off during launch and hit the left leading edge of the wing. There's a tremendous amount of heat on those leading edges during entry, right about the point where they lost contact. You cannot help but wonder, and again, no one likes to speculate in an aerospace accident because the first impressions, as you've said repeatedly, are often incorrect. But certainly it's something we want to keep in mind as they look through the data and the telemetry, is to find out if that could have possibly had any impact today. Just simply because if there was an area of damage and the kind of heat they see on entry, that could, in theory, be a factor here.
Well, Bill, we want to bring in Dr. Ed Crawley of MIT, the aeronautics and aeronautics chairman at MIT. Dr. Crawley, can you give us some observations that might put this in context for us?
Well, Dan, this video that we've seen now from several different angles will be a very important piece of evidence. You might remember that after the Challenger accident, where video was in fact important in the accident investigation, there was a decision to have even more and higher quality video at the time of launch. And this particular video, you can see it right there. There's a little piece of something that falls off early, and just about in here, the spacecraft appears to bloom, as if the attitude of the spacecraft changes, and here we see what appears to be other parts of the spacecraft on independent tracks. So they'll go back and replay this video frame by frame hundreds of times to see if they can discern from this what that first little bit coming off of might have been, what the sequence of events was, to see if they can get any flight dynamic information, to see if they can filter the video to see if they see the nose pitch up or pitch down, to try and develop an understanding of the sequences of events here.
Dr. Kroll, if you'll hang in there with us in Boston, and Bill Harwood in Florida also hang on as we play this amateur video again, which is going to be a strong piece of evidence for the investigation by NASA. On the telephone with us now is Mr. Doug Haviland, who is the uncle of Columbia astronaut Laurel Clark. Navy Commander Laurel Clark, a medical doctor, was a rookie astronaut, that is, making her first flight. I want to point out that Mr. Haviland's son was killed at the World Trade Center on 9/11. Mr. Haviland, thank you for being with us this morning. Tell us about your niece, Laurel Clark.
Well, she was accepted in the space program, became an astronaut. She was very enthused about it. This is what she wanted to do, and she was dedicated to the task, and she knew the risks that were there, but she felt that they were very safety conscious, and this is what she really wanted to do.
How proud you must be of her.
Yes, the whole family is. My sister, her mother, is in Arizona, and she had her misgivings, I think, but she was really proud of Laurel as taking this on.
Well, naturally, members of the family would have their misgivings. Did you ever hear the Commander, Laurel Clark, talk about her misgivings or the danger of the flight?
But she felt that, NASA was so safety conscious that she did not live in dread or anything like that, I'm sure. Last night I picked up on the internet email that she had sent back to Earth just shortly before this all happened. And she starts out, "Hello from above our magnificent planet Earth. The perspective is truly awe-inspiring. This is a terrific mission, and we are very busy doing science round the clock." And so that expresses her attitude, I think, as to how she felt about what she was doing.
We thank you very much for being with us, and we offer our condolences to you and the members of the family, as we do to members of all the families of the 7 astronauts aboard this flight, including 6 Americans and 1 Israeli.
Thank you, Dan.
I'll repeat something that Colonel Mike Mulhane, a veteran and now retired astronaut, said earlier. He said he was, quote, terrified at all 3 launches in which he took part. He said once past the launch, that there was no doubt in his mind that that's the most terrifying moment. Now, perhaps it was the most terrifying moment for because other reasons that Challenger had exploded in 1986, just 73 seconds after launch. But on launch, as Colonel Mulhane described it to us here at CBS this morning, there's this tremendous sound, tremendous quaking, and that's the proper verb, of the Space Shuttle, that even a brave man like Colonel Mulhane, a veteran, always terrified him, he said. But he said once in orbit, it was relaxing. He described a kind of floating sense and no sense of danger in orbit way up there on the high frontier. And he said there was some apprehension at the time of reentry, some apprehension, but he said it was basically no big deal, and that what he was feeling on all 3 flights, once they got to the point where the shuttle was today, or something similar in case they landed in California, the long glide toward home that will go so quickly. He said he was thinking of just how tired he was and how glad he would be to get to sleep. If that gives us any perspective on what these brave astronauts may have been thinking and experiencing today. In Washington, Marcia Smith, a space agency analyst. Ms. Smith, thank you for being with us. What's the future of the American Humans in Space program now that we have suffered this tragedy today?
Well, of course, everyone is very appropriately focused right now on the human tragedy that is unfolding. But there is a very practical aspect of this as well. Columbia was one of the 4 space shuttle orbiters, that now there are only 3 left. And the space shuttle's mission for the foreseeable future is to support the space station program. We do have 3 astronauts aboard the space station right now, and the space shuttle's job really is to take more segments of the space station up into orbit, to rotate the crews. They rotate every 4 to 6 months, and to take up supplies and to bring back the results of scientific experiments. So from a practical standpoint, I think everyone's going to be looking at the human spaceflight program and try to determine, what do we do now?
Ma'am, let me ask you, after the Challenger explosion back in 1986, there was talk then again of the space program going away. What do you think at that time turned the tide and made Americans and made the U.S. government say to itself, you know, we need to keep this up?
I actually don't remember talk of the space station going away at the time of Challenger. In fact, I think everyone rallied behind NASA and the space program at the time, and the public seemed very supportive of spending the money that it would take to build a replacement orbiter, which was Endeavour. Of course, one of the differences now is that NASA had in the pipeline at the manufacturer then structural spares in order to help them build another orbiter, because they'd been thinking of building one and then decided not to. And I'm not aware that there are any structural spares now to build an additional orbiter. So NASA's going to have to look at its future plans, how it's going to continue building the space station and servicing the space station with 3 orbiters instead of 4. That's a very practical aspect of what happened today.
Yeah, how much do these vessels cost? And I think what I hear you saying is it's going to be a tough sell from here on out. Tougher sell, I should say.
I don't know if it's going to be a tough sell. I still think the American people are very supportive of the space program, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them once again rally behind NASA. But from a financing standpoint, as I recall it, Endeavour cost about $2 billion, and that was in 1986. So what it would cost today, starting from scratch, I really don't know what that number would be.